Okay, good morning, or whatever your local time is, everyone. Some people are still joining, but that's okay. We're just recapping what we did yesterday and looking at what today will be about. So yesterday, day two, we started off by looking at how to quantify parallel performance and how to understand what our expectations are in terms of how codes will run in parallel. And the take-home message there was that no piece of software will scale with 100% efficiency to arbitrarily large number of cores. I mean, maybe that's an obvious thing to say, but the point is that in general, if you run something on 10 times or X times as many processors, you can't expect it necessarily to go X times as fast. There's always, eventually the parallelism kind of runs out, but we gave you some tools to understand how to measure how it runs out and to make a judgment when you're using software on whatever computer you're using it on. Could be your laptop, could be a group machine cluster, could be a large high performance computer. So we gave you the tools to judge what is a good scale to run it on based on what kind of efficiency you're willing to accept, and also based on how quickly you want your answer. So the holy grail is of this kind of parallel computing, which not everybody cares about, but is to be able to get your answer as quickly as possible by using lots of cores to speed things up. And if it runs with 100% efficiency, you would not be using any more compute budgets, say, compute time, CPU time, but in reality, that's not always the case. So then we looked at continuing the sequence alignment practical and seeing how the parallel scaling is there. So you got some experience in that. Then we focused on the two sides of everything in computing, which is the software and the hardware. Looking at some of the building blocks, computers generally, but especially the most important key things for performance in high performance computers, namely on the software side, understanding processes and threads, and how these are relevant to running software in a shared memory and distributed memory contexts. And on the hardware side, trying to we looked at especially processors, memory, and accelerators, and we tried to clarify in particular this key thing about what is a processor, what is a core, what is a multi-core processor, what is a CPU, what does all these things mean. And we also looked at some of the things that go into processors like vectorization and things that you might come across if you're compiling software. Then we continued with we had a couple of practical sessions on molecular dynamics, so you gained some experience there running GROMACS, looking at the scaling, including at the effect of running hybrid threaded and process-based shared memory plus distributed memory, MPI plus OpenMP jobs. And also there was a discussion about how parallel programming models enable software to run in parallel. So essentially explaining what MPI is, explaining what OpenMP is, so you know what these terms mean a bit more, and also to give you some idea of how GPUs are programmed. So things like CUDA and HIP, which if you've not come across already, you might come across, and so you hopefully have a better understanding of that. Talked about compiling software, what's involved in compiling software, and why you might want to do so and be interested in doing so. So today we're going to continue with a session on molecular dynamics, looking at one of the aspects that we highlighted yesterday in the hardware lecture, namely simultaneous multi-threading, SMT, just to see if that has any impact on GROMACS performance. Then I'll give a lecture on looking at how pipelines, maybe more looking at the data-intensive pipelines that you might encounter in bioinformatics applications, how those can run in parallel in HPC, what are some of the challenges there, and also looking at more biomolecular modeling simulation workflows, and these can be deployed on HPC platforms efficiently. That I'll talk about. One solution that BioExcel has worked on, which is BioBB. More about that later. So today also we'll continue with another practical, which is on running hybrid quantum mechanical classical molecular dynamics using cpgk. And we'll look at one of the aspects that we highlighted on day one that was important to performance, which is this balance between computation and communication. We'll also look at some of the trends in upcoming years in HPC, Some of these trends are starting to arrive now, so depending on what machines you're using and will end up using in the next couple of years, you'll have a better sense of what's coming and to understand these machines that you'll be using, potentially programming for, who knows, in the future. We'll look at it. We have an overview of sort of the landscape of HPC in the UK and EU, what kind of machines are available, and at the end of the day, we'll try to open the questions, and happy to talk to you about lots of things. So I will hand over to Julian, who's running the practical.
Thanks, Arno, and sorry everyone for showing the tunnel. Just to make sure I was doing something else. Arno, you might have mentioned this before, but just to make sure that everyone's aware, we are still recording all of these sessions, and all of these sessions will be made available on YouTube after the fact. So if there's any bits you miss or you're interested in revising or in seeing again, please note that we will upload all of these videos on YouTube, and already we have the video from day 1 is already available for people to watch. So day 2 will probably be on shortly after this, and we'll have day 3 probably as well soon after this. So with that having been said, let's move on to our final GROMACS benchmarking tutorial. So far, what have we done with our GROMACS benchmarking tutorials? Well, we've seen evidence of strong scaling, and I showed you, I plotted the results that we'd all obtained as a group, and saw the strong scaling and speed up as we increased the number of processors. We'd also had to play around with running hybrid MPI and OpenMP versions of GROMACS. And these, again, we got some very interesting results where we noticed that actually using 2 OpenMP threads for 64 MPI processes got the best results, and that if you used any number of threads and processes, that meant that you were going over NUMA regions or splitting certain jobs over NUMA regions, then your total wall time was going through the roof. And today, as Arno mentioned, we're going to have a look at simultaneous multi-threading and whether it's GROMACS performance on ARCHER2, and perhaps as well on whether load balancing affects GROMACS performance on ARCHER2. So I've uploaded the codes that I'll be talking about in /work/ta017/shared/uppercase GROMACS I have uploaded, I'll put this in the link in the chat. Apologies for the tunnel, everyone. There we go. So I've uploaded all of the Slurm submission scripts. The one for yesterday's practical is here, and the one for today's practical is going to be, or the first part of today's practical is going to be GMX sub 3. And if I look at GMX sub 2, so the one from yesterday's practical, you'll notice that and for all of the jobs that we've run so far, we've had this command for Slurm, which is hint no multi-thread. And by using this command, what we're telling Slurm is we're saying we don't want multi-threading. However, today I'd like us to see what happens if we do include multi-threading. And so for that, I've created a new Slurm input file if anyone just wants to use this. It's got the correct reservation code for today. You can either comment or uncomment to run on the short queue or on the reservation. I would recommend running on the reservation because there should be plenty of nodes today. We had to ask for more nodes because of the CP2K practicals. But you'll notice 2 major differences. The first one is that I am no longer saying hint no multi-thread because there's a space there. So this is a commented line rather than an s-batch command. And the other thing as well is here where I've said tasks per node, the tasks per node and CPUs per task, when multiplied, can now equal 256 because I'm considering multi-threaded cores rather than physical cores. That's effectively doubled the number of cores that I can use. So to start today's tutorial, I was thinking we could do something similar to what we did yesterday of running a different number of tasks per node, CPUs per tasks, and everyone who finds the wall time, the performance for all of these jobs. But let's do it without multi-threading. And then at the end of the session, we can compare the results from today's runs with multi-threading compared to yesterday's runs without multi-threading. So with that, that's enough of an introduction to the to this. One thing I wanted to point out as well is if you've got time at the end, if you realize that this is running quite quickly, or if you already know there's going to be about whether multi-threading is better or not for GROMACS, you can also try. There's a mini thing at the end of the session where you can try to remove load balancing. And what load balancing does is it makes sure that all of the cores that you're running on have about the same amount of work. If you remove that, then some cores might end up having more work than others, and that might all affect your code's performance. So you can do this by adding the -dlb no command to your gmx MPI mdrun command. Right, so with that, I will leave it, pass it over to you. And I'm gonna quickly change what I'm sharing. Okay, I see that we've already got a fair few results for this multi-threaded practical. Could I ask, could you put your hand up if you'd like a few more minutes to finish running a couple of simulations? Arno's let me know that the pipelines lecture is likely to be shorter than we'd anticipated, which means that we've got a couple more minutes for this practical now. So please put your hands up if, let's do it the easy way. Please put your hands up if you're finished and you're happy for me to go on. Okay, there's about 5 people, so I'll give it another 1 or 2 minutes for people to catch up and finish up with this. Okay, great. I noticed that there's now a lot more entries. Don't worry if you've not got all of them yet. There'll be you'll still have access to ARCHER2 for a while after this course if you're interested in doing in studying these in a lot more depth. But also we've got more than enough entries to start making some inferences about the results of this. So let's start off with the very basic run, where there's a single thread per logical core, and the runtimes seem to be, I'm going to say, averaging at around 13 or 14, and that one seems wrong, which is mine. That's a bit embarrassing, but hey. So 13 or 14 seconds for a total performance of about 122 nanoseconds per day. Comparing that to what we got yesterday, yesterday we were at also 14-ish seconds and 120 nanoseconds per day. So you're maybe getting a 2 nanoseconds out of 120. What's that? That's 1 in 60 increase, maybe, and it might just be a case of we were luckier with the nodes that we were using. So far, so roughly similar. When we increase to two threads, so 128 128 MPI processes and 2 OpenMP tasks per process, we stick at the higher end of 14 seconds. So it seems to be oscillating between 14 and 15 seconds for a performance of about 116 nanoseconds per day. Now, this is quite interesting and very different from what we got yesterday, because yesterday, if I remember correctly, on 2 threads, we were getting better performance. So yeah, it took 12 seconds, 12, nearly 13 seconds for 138 seconds per day. So all of a sudden, we're not getting as much of an improvement when using 2 threads with multi-threading than when we were using a single thread than when we were using 2 threads without multi-threading. Now, yesterday, without multi-threading, we noticed that there was a huge jump between 2 threads and 3 threads, and that there was a huge decrease from 3 threads to 4 threads. Does that still happen? Well, let's have a look. There is still a jump, but it is not as significant a jump. We're going from 15 to 30 seconds, whereas yesterday we were getting an order of magnitude difference. Now, I'm not entirely sure why that is, but I think one of the reasons why that might be is, you know how yesterday I mentioned the jump in time is because of the threads which are spread across multiple NUMA regions. Well, because here we've got more threads, there'll be a higher number of there'll be you'd expect that there'll be a smaller proportion of total threads that are spread across NUMA regions, which means that it'll have less overall effect on the time. But again, I'm postulating here, and I'm not too sure whether that is correct or not. Looking a bit further, so there's an increase, about a 2-fold increase rather than a 10-fold increase from 2 to 3, and then there is a roughly 2-fold decrease from 3 to 4. Again, the 4 processors are performing a tiny bit slower, or the 4 threads are performing a tiny bit slower than the 2 threads methods, and so far we seem to have 1 thread is the best, 2 threads is slightly worse, 4 threads is slightly worse, 8 threads is slightly worse, 16 threads is slightly worse, and then 32 even worse, and then 64 the worst of the lot. But the difference between the 64 threads, which took about 62 seconds, and the single threads, which took about 14 seconds, is a factor of 4 increase in time. Whereas yesterday, if I remember correctly, so we never bothered with the 32 ones, but we were already getting more than a factor of 10 increase when we were using 8 threads. So for some reason, the multi-threading is helping the higher threaded runs. So that's an interesting thing to note, especially if you're really interested in threading. However, you'll notice that for multi-threading, your best bet is to still not include threads, whereas for not multi-threaded, and indeed the total best performance that we've gotten so far is a run with multi-threading, without multi-threading, and with 2 threads per CPU task, so 2 threads per MPI task. So that's quite interesting. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about was and there's already been a couple of questions about this in chat. But the final thing that I wanted to talk about was removing the load balancing. So GROMACS by default performs dynamic load balancing. What does that mean? That means that every time step or every couple of time steps, the GROMACS program will take time to make sure that all of the processors, all of the cores, have the same load of jobs to do. Now, we mentioned yesterday that having high imbalance can lead to huge drop-offs in performance. So this seems like a sensible thing to do, because that way you're making sure that all of your cores have the same amount of job to do, that they'll finish roughly at the same time, and that you don't have many cores running idly. And in most cases, in probably 90% of the cases that you'll come across, using dynamic load balancing is a good idea. However, if you have a system which is roughly uniform and where you're roughly aware that you will have, where you know that even if it's split up in the most basic fashion, all processors will have roughly the same amount of work to do to within 5%. You might not need to do load balancing, and indeed, load balancing might might increase the amount of time that it takes for your simulation to run. Why is that? Well, because dynamic load balancing, the process of calculating the load on each processors, is a time-consuming process and a computational time-consuming process, which means that you're spending time calculating this, which you might not need if your system is pretty uniform. In this case, I imagine that if we remove load balancing, it will not go very well. Let's just go in, I don't know, let's go in run 1. The easiest way to do this would be if you look at your submission script. This is my submission script. I'm going to do it for the most simple case of, let's do it for the best case, because the best case scenario would be fun. So the best case scenario that we had was 64 tasks per node, 2 CPUs per task, with multi-threading. I'm not sharing my thing, am I? Yeah. Thank you very much for the comment. That should go there. And let me share my shell. Actually, let me share my entire screen. There we go. Cool. So I'm going to run in the best case scenario that we've seen so far, which has 64 tasks per node, 2 CPUs per tasks. That was a quick experiment that I was running, but I'll run that later. And no multi-thread. This is exactly the same, or it should be very similar to the GMX sub_2. And now I want minus dynamic load balancing, and I think it's 0, but yeah, no. Okay, fine. No. Hopefully, if I run this, there we go, it's currently running. Based on yesterday's results, this should take roughly 14 seconds, and 13 even. And it isn't. It's already taking longer, which means that we're losing performance because of not having included the dynamic load balancing. What does that tell us? Well, that tells us that very likely, it'll be called this, very likely, sorry, one moment. I'm just going to move this to no DLB dot log. I'm going to just run an exact like-for-like comparison. Actually, I can run them on the same node just to make sure. Sorry, I'm thinking about this on the fly, which is maybe not the best thing to do. But yeah, so let's do that, and let's do that. And I want to move that to no TLB, and I want to move that to with DLB. So what I'm doing here is I'm running 2 jobs in the same Slurm script. I'm going to run 1 MPI job without dynamic load balancing and 1 with dynamic load balancing. That way I can compare the outputs for exactly the same node. I heard a ting. What is the ting? That Gustafsson's law works as intended, especially on bigger systems, and the workload balance is a major contribution to the performance. Yeah. Yes, so definitely this is a very small system, which means that, yeah, as your system increases, actually, you're usually just going to generally be closer to load balancing, unless you've got a very bizarre system, especially for molecular dynamics. These should have finished. Yes, they have. And now if I tail no DLB and tail 6 DLB, it's with DLB. Well, what's the difference? Here I'm running at around 130 nanoseconds per day versus 137 nanoseconds per day. So that is an increase of about 7 over 130, which is, I don't know, call it 3.5 over 75, which is not very useful. Yeah, so it's quite a noticeable increase in the time it takes. So for this particular system, also potentially because it is quite a small system or a relatively small system, you will end up with certain nodes, certain cores that'll have less work to do. So load balancing might be worth it, especially if you're running a longer job. With that, there was one final thing that I wanted to point out, which is there's been some questions about how to what's the word I'm looking for? There's been some questions about how to get the best performance out of GROMACS. And Arno has written a section of a GROMACS best practice guide, which is entirely dedicated to how to get the best bang for your buck, as it was, using GROMACS. I can't quite remember where I could find that. Arno, could you put the link in the chat, please, if you've got it?
Yeah, sure. We can also give a link later as well.
Cool. We'll give the link later in that case, because I realize that I'm probably at the point where you probably want to take over.
Sure.
In which case, that's it for the GROMACS tutorial, and I'll pass on to Arno.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me just get this up. Okay, so next bit, I wanted to talk about pipelines and workflows. So as I already said, it's going to be kind of two sections. The first bit is about pipelines that are aimed a bit more at data-intensive bioinformatics type computing, and then the other part will be about more kind of biomolecular modeling and simulation workflows. So when it comes to these kind of pipelines and running these in HPC machines, we're going to have a look at how that works, if it can be done efficiently. We'll talk a little bit about the potential role that something like MapReduce can play, which is it's a programming model, but it's also actually a parallel decomposition pattern that I didn't mention on Monday, but it's just another example. And I'll mention one software package called Halvade that is an example where the MapReduce model has been used through another piece of software called Hadoop, which is kind of an engine that does MapReduce decompositions. So yeah, this is just to highlight some of the challenges. So the question is, I mean, so our colleagues at EBI, EMBL have massive infrastructure for doing lots of bioinformatics work, and these lots of cores, lots of processors, very big machines. These are used by lots of researchers. Are these high-performance computers? Yes, I mean they're big computers, but they don't necessarily have the interconnect because their workloads don't necessarily run software that wants to use lots of nodes at the same time for a very tightly coupled simulation of the kind that you might be doing with biomolecular simulation, or with indeed lots of other codes in HPC, like quantum mechanical, quantum chemistry codes. Like, as you'll see, cp2k, the number of nodes that we've reserved for the cp2k practical is larger because the codes do a lot of QM calculations, are very intensive, so and they're very tightly coupled. So that's why the interconnect matters there. So, but the question is, when it comes to, can we in principle run individual sort of bioinformatics pipeline type jobs on an HPC system in parallel and get the answer much very, very quickly? So instead of doing lots of small jobs, each of which might use a single node, can we use multiple nodes to do a single job much more quickly? So, I mean, so people, if anybody has any more, insight into this from bioinformatics background, is very welcome to hear. But the impression we have is that many bioinformatics tools are parallelized using threading only and not MPI. I'll actually point out one example of a counter case, which is a very nice example in a minute, or after these slides. But a lot of tools are parallelized with threading only, so they're obviously suited to using one single shared memory node. And in fact, the machines that are ideal for a lot of these calculations are big shared memory machines. So a single machine that has lots of memory, that has a single operating system, has lots of one big giant amount of shared memory with however many cores you can get in there. And as we saw, that's possible to make, but it's has its own limitations in terms of cost and efficiency and everything. So so if we're talking about using distributed memory systems, clusters, and high-performance computers with a tool that only does threading, we cannot use more than one node at a given time. And even within a single node, it's not clear that necessarily it scales well to however many cores there might be. If there's 12, 24, 48, 64, 128, however many cores there are, it's not clear that it always scales well. So I said few tools use MPI, which you've seen it's important. The counterexample I give does use MPI. So what is kind of the challenge? Well, this is an example which is a real example of a bioinformatics sort of pipeline that when I first saw it, both simultaneously, I found really impressive, also kind of horrifying and amusing. So to simplify a bit, take it a bit more abstractly, what's actually happening here is that there are 8 executables named A through H. So this is in a bash shell as a command line using various applications, 8 different applications, namely PWA, let's see, some SAM tools. Some of these might be familiar if you do this kind of work. Now, 4 out of these 8 executables are multi-threaded in principle. However, some of them use open and pthreads, some of them use pthreads. Pthreads is an operating system type thread, POSIX thread, which is simply not controlled in the same way that open and pthreads are. And we're not sure necessarily how, if you see this line, you're not sure how efficient in parallel any given one of these executables that are multi-threaded is if we run in parallel. So you have no idea how the optimal number of threads, what the optimal number of threads is to use on them, assuming you even can assign a specific number of threads to them, which is not clear how to do easily, because this command, single command, which has the pipes that take the output from one command and pipe it in, feed it into the next command, they don't necessarily allow straightforward control over the kind of parallel threaded execution. So we're mostly kind of just firing this off and hoping that the operating system does something sensible, and it probably does do something sensible. But yeah, it's a complicated situation and difficult to control and difficult to get an insight into how it performs, and difficult to maybe deploy on a machine and sort of see how to run efficiently. So these things also can take days to run. So that's not necessarily even possible on a lot of HPC machines, which have a time limit on the jobs. So a lot of HPC codes do what is called checkpointing, where they save the state every so often, and then they can restart. So it's difficult to improve these kind of pipelines. So you need to carefully tease apart the performance of each step. So this works, and people obviously do useful work with this, but the problem is kind of deploying it more generally. So you want to kind of maybe see if there's ways to do this, the same underlying thing in a more controlled manner. So one way to do this is to use a model called a decomposition approach called MapReduce, which is, I'm not going to go too much into details, but the point is that it's just some kind of way of, think of it a bit like a task farm, the decomposition I described on Monday, except that it also takes into account the movement of data that is necessary to put into place on whatever node where the cores are doing particular work associated with a task. So that the work to be done gets split up into tasks, which can involve different executables, maybe, and then the data that is needed to perform these tasks on is moved around, the computation is done, and the data is regathered back again, all part of the same framework. Now, the MapReduce pattern, a decomposition pattern, has been implemented in something called Hadoop, which is a piece of software that's essentially an engine that does MapReduce. So, and it's nice because it tidies up after itself. It checks if something fails, if for some reason there's a hardware issue with one of the nodes, then it will notice that and it will redeploy the tasks that need to be computed somewhere else. So Halvade is an example of a package that people put together to try and run the kind of sequencing pipelines in parallel on an HPC machine, or anyway on a cluster on multiple nodes in a distributed memory context. It uses Hadoop. multi-core threaded and multi-node, and it runs various stages. For example, some of which you saw in the earlier command as well: PWA alignment, data preparation using Picard, and variant calling using GATK. So to put together Half8, the developers looked at what the single node threaded efficiency is of each of these things, PWA, Picard, and GATK, and use that to have Half8 allocate for the user the optimal number of threads for each tool. So that's kind of an experimental thing. And doing so, they were able to get good parallel efficiency, up to about 90%, doing some kind of whole human genome analysis on a distributed memory cluster using 16 nodes, 512 cores in total. So they're kind of generic cluster. So that's good. So it seems kind of promising. However, it's not necessarily the case that all HPC machines make it easy to put this kind of infrastructure in place. So there's, there is basically that these systems, all of these HPC systems, are very optimized towards, they've got the operating system is very minimalized to cut down the impact on performance on each node. So the kind of monitoring that a framework like Hadoop needs to do to move all the data around a system, sometimes it doesn't sit well with the way these HPC machines are set up. So also it's a little bit about the user community around these machines. So some smaller machines might be more flexible. So there's definitely scope there. So when it comes to generally deploying these kind of pipelines and also workflows, which we'll talk about in a bit, on HPC systems, the challenges that are faced are that there's a real diversity, which is a bit similar to early decades of parallel computing, where it wasn't clear what the best way was to be able to run stuff on multiple nodes, and eventually MPI emerged as a standard. So the idea is that it would be nice if some kind of standard way of doing things emerged, where people could share their pipelines and workflows in a reproducible way, and have a way of running these in a kind of a well-supported way that's portable and available on lots of different systems. So you knew that's what MPI enabled for parallel codes. You knew that if you were writing a software with MPI, you could run it in parallel on lots of different machines. You didn't have to do anything special. So the idea is that some of the frameworks, like the workflow languages and workflow managers, might aim to support this. And in fact, we'll talk about a workflow manager called pycomps that does aim to support this in the case of biomolecular modeling simulation workflows. If we give an example about that. So the advantage there would be that you, as a user, you write, instead of having a single command that's passed, that big massive single command line with 8 pipes that's passed down from researcher to researcher and modified, etc. Instead of that, you might have a workflow pipeline that's specified in a consistent language, and that can be the underlying software can then deploy that workflow or pipeline in parallel in some well-defined way. Well, something we haven't really talked about so far is in HPC in this course is about containers. So containers are a bit like virtual machines. All they do is it provides a way to set up an environment, software environment for code to run in that is where everything is defined about what versions of other software is available. So it's a really good tool for reproducibility. An example of, so you might have heard of Docker as an example of a type of container technology. For HPC, there's also available, it also goes by the name Singularity. So this provides a way to get over some of the software hurdles on cluster HPC machines, which means that workflows and pipelines could be transitioned from other machines like laptops or desktops or servers to other clusters. So that's becoming increasingly available, and including on large HPC machines. So in summary for these, we've identified some of the challenges in porting these workflows and pipelines. There's some frameworks that have a lot of promise, but there are also some barriers. So now I want to just point out one example of a system, of an application that actually I said, so let me share. So I said very few applications for doing bioinformatics or sequencing work use MPI. So maybe there's not that many, but there are some, and I think you should be able to see this. So this is a good example. This is a tool called Dissect, which does genomic relationship analysis. So it constructs matrices and wants to of genetic relatedness and tries to compute the statistical analyses of these matrices. So these latent matrices are very large because, of course, you have things like data sources, like in the UK, for example, the UK Biobank, which has lots of genomic data. So you would like to be able to perform these analyses on large HPC machines. And Dissect can do that very nicely, because what they've done is they've done the kind of things that we've said are important for HPC codes. They have on the left-hand side, you can see you've got the problem, which is this: you want to compute this entire giant genetic relationship matrix. What they've done is they've split that problem up into blocks. Literally, they've split up the matrix into blocks. Each compute node is then assigned a number of these blocks, and the cores on that compute node can compute the relationship matrix itself, or statistical quantities derived from it. And one of the nice things they've done is that they've also used high-performance numerical libraries. So Holly yesterday mentioned that one of the key things to performance is using libraries to perform, for example, linear algebra, which is very relevant here, which themselves can run in parallel. So that's a nice example of a tool that enables that. So now I'll go on to the second part of this. Which is about more the biomolecular modeling simulation workflows. Okay, so I'd like to tell you a little bit about something that BioExcel has been involved in, has basically produced over the past few years. And my colleague from the Institute for Research in Biomolecular Medicine in Barcelona has been a driving force. Adam Hospital has been a driving force behind creating a framework called BioBB, which is as we'll see, is a way of describing workflows. So what BioBB is the BB stands for building blocks, and Bio stands for BioExcel. So these are BioExcel building blocks, and what they enable is to describe workflows in a consistent, systematic way, in a modular way, doing exactly the kind of things I said would be useful to be able to share workflows reproducibly. And what BioBB tries to do is handle the interoperability of different tools that are involved in biomolecular modeling simulation workflows. So you have file formats, all these kind of aspects that are involved in taking data that's produced by one kind of analysis or preparation step or analysis step, and making it, feeding it into the next step. It tries to take care of all of that, all those pieces. So in other words, it tries to give you the building blocks and make sure that the building blocks fit together so that you can build your workflows out of these building blocks. And then the next stage, after these workflows have been constructed and defined using these in a systematic way, using the building blocks, they can then be run, for example, on a cluster, on an HPC machine, using a workflow manager. And we'll show that a workflow manager called pycoms enables workflows that are described using BioBB to execute on large machines. So examples of the kind of workflows that you could do and tackle and describe with BioBB is very clearly molecular dynamics simulations, associated free energy calculations. You could do mutational screening. These are just some examples, and it's constantly being expanded. And this has been used within BioExcel and external colleagues as well to farm out, to do research on large machines using large number of cores. So the idea is that this should be flexible and easy to adapt. So what's the basic idea? The basic idea is that you write your workflow in Python. So BioBB is a Python framework, Python package, in fact. So it's a Python module that you import, and it provides function calls within for Python to describe for you to describe your workflow. So you write your workflow in Python using BioBB. Then this gets the way that all your different building blocks in your analysis relate to each other, that gets analyzed and built into so that all those building blocks, when they end up executing, are all individual tasks which somehow need to be run in parallel. If they can indeed be run in parallel, they might depend on each other. So part of you using BioBB is telling it how things depend on each other, how the blocks fit together, which one goes on top of the other. So therefore, the one that goes on top, the one that's below needs to execute first. Otherwise, the one on top is nothing to stand on. So that gets analyzed and put into a graph of the dependency of all these tasks, and that then gets executed on a resource like a high performance computer using a workflow manager like pycomps. And again, similar to the example I gave of Half8 using hadoop, it does it in such a way that it tries to be fault tolerant, so that if for some reason some node fails, which happens, it's not the case that the entire thing collapses. You've wasted all the effort of jobs that did run successfully, but it actually tries to relaunch things that failed. So fault tolerance is an issue as well. So how does it work? Well, it has kind of two aspects. On the left-hand side here, you see your description of your workflow, which is Python code, which uses BioBB. So each of these steps here: step 1, download the PDB; step 2, fix the side chain; step 3, generate the topology; step 4, create the solvent box, etc., etc. Then energy minimization, step 8. Pre-processing. Okay, so there's all kinds of steps, and then so these are all individual blocks. Each individual step uses an individual BioBB building block, and then on the right hand side, you provide parameters that describe, for example, what kind of force field you want to use, what the actual PDB file is. So on the left, kind of the abstract description of the workflow. On the right are specific parameters for your job, and that includes also well, to see things about the execution on the resources. As an example, let's look at using BioBB to set up an MD simulation. And the steps involved in that would be to get a list of the PDB files involved, and then topology generation, energy minimization, calibrate the system, and actually run the simulation. So on the left-hand side, we have our Python script that describes the workflow using BioBB. And it actually has a for loop at the top, which says for each of our input structures, for each of our PDBs, which is provided on the right-hand side. So on the right-hand side, you can see that the input structures parameter specifies which PDBs are involved. So pycoms will, so when pycoms, the workflow manager, starts to actually execute or manage the execution of this workflow, it looks at this Python script and it sees, okay, I can see there's a for loop there, so let me analyze what that means. That means that if you think back to the picture of the dependency graph, it means that there may be a number of branches that I can execute in parallel, because each structure I want to do, it's not a single MD simulation. It's lots of MD simulation, maybe one for each structure, maybe even many for each structure. So it analyzes that based on the workflow that you've described, so that it knows how to, what it can actually deploy in parallel. And you can see the input parameters for each step are described on the right-hand side. So the setting up and running an MD simulation is just one example of a workflow, and BioExcel has provided templates for using BioBB for a number of different workflows, including, as I already said, so virtual screening, for energy calculations. That's just some examples. So how does this work? So concretely, if we're running this on a particular system, say on a system in Barcelona, the Mare Nostrum 4, then the things that that we need to specify are to run this particular system are or particular environment modules that are loaded to provide Python and PyBB itself on the system, also to make the workflow manager available, to load Singularity, which provides a way of launching and running our containers that set up the software environment for simulations, and to load GROMACS, and then the input parameters that are relevant for actually executing the molecular dynamics simulations are these some of these scheduler parameters here. So as you've seen with the batch scripts, just specifies the number of nodes and the wall time, how many CPUs, tasks, etc. The syntax is a bit different than you might be used to, but for example, from here, you see QoS, so it's probably Slurm, I think. And then you actually get pycoms to launch the workflow in the following way, as described here by running workflow.py. So that's fine. So that's on Mare Nostrum. How about if you were to want to run the same workflow on a different system? Well, a couple of things change. So say you've got some system, for example, some system in France, at CAE. The things that change might be there's a slightly different version of maybe the PyBB and pycoms. Then instead of Singularity, there's Docker that's used, and that there might be a couple other changes, but that's it. So you can really separate out things in a modular way like that. Some examples of how this is being used is using well, not molecular dynamics simulation, but using hadoop, which is a docking molecular docking code. Using Mare Nostrum, in fact, using 50 nodes of Mare Nostrum, 2,400 cores in total. One run each node, so 200 executions. And you can see that pycoms, effectively manages the execution of all of these jobs as one single job in a sense. So one of the key things about this is that the kinds of things that these workflow managers can run in parallel are steps in the workflow that themselves are independent. So this is the it's not on the tightly coupled end of simulation regime, but it's more on the end of trying to analyze which tasks within the workflows can be run in parallel. So rather than you needing to figure this out, it does it for you, which maybe provides a lot of flexibility. The question is, so BioBB optimizes the performance. I would say pycomps. Yeah, I mean, BioBB allows you to describe the workflow. So first of all, it takes care of some interoperability issues and provides some sanity, and it also makes it easier for people to share workflows and to use templates for workflows that are being produced by others. So BioBB describes the workflows, and then that gets analyzed by pycoms to actually analyze how the steps of the workflow depend on each other, and then to execute those steps in an optimal way on whatever hardware you're running on. So BioBB makes it possible to execute these things in an optimized way, but I guess you might say that it's pycoms that actually executes them in an optimized way. But obviously they're linked together. I mean, one feeds into the other. So I was saying this. The example is the kinds of things that this parallelizes is the tasks within workflows that can be run independently, rather than trying to manage. It doesn't try to manage pycoms. Doesn't try to manage, for example, MPI communications between tasks. That's not what it's trying to do. So in a sense, that is less reliant. The performance there is not so much from having a high performance interconnect. It's more from other things that make maybe more generic clusters, make them large resources that you can use effectively doing this. So let's look at an example doing just MD simulations, and there's a link here to the BioXL GitHub with examples of HPC workflows using BioBB. To set this up, so effectively you can see that you specify, so if you're running this on Mare Nostrum, you would specify the following runtime parameters, number of nodes you want, etc. It's the same kind of thing that I talked about before. List of structures that you want to run the MD simulations on, which goes in the YAML file. And what you can do is you can, and this has been used to very effectively to do research, which you can publish in the following paper. And what you can do is you can then farm off and run lots of simulations, 13 MD simulations with sodium, 13 with potassium, and 13 with both, each using around 5,000 cores and with variants of 2 different force fields. So if you were to do this all manually, it'd be a bit of a nightmare, quite error prone, and it might not be optimal. But now it really takes, cleans things up and manages a lot of stuff for you. So it can be a really effective productivity tool for using high-performance computers to do this kind of, to deploy these kind of workflows. So it can be really nice. And Adam and colleagues are doing all the hard work to try and make the interoperability work between these building blocks. And the people at BSC, Supercomputing Center in Barcelona, are doing all the hard work to try and make pycomps deploy these things efficiently in parallel on high-performance computers. So they're doing a lot of the work for you. So if you use it, you can get a lot of the benefit, ideally. Just some more information. So you can find information about, if you're interested in trying this, you can look up the following website above. And there's also information on our website, and on our YouTube channel, you'll find a webinar, at least one webinar about BioBB. And there's a paper as well listed top left here, which you can look up. So there's a lot of information out there if you're interested. It is possible to use on the Maden Ostrom 4 supercomputer, and it's also being looked at running on a few other machines, actually including Cirrus here at EPCC. But if you're interested, I would say have a look at the links that I showed earlier. And if you're very enthusiastic, then by all means contact my colleague, our colleague Adam. Okay, so that is all that I wanted to say about that. Yep, okay. So anybody have any questions about any of that? If not, then there's a break. And after the break, we start again with the practical that Holly's running on QMM using cpgk. Feel free to put any questions if they occur to you into the chat between now and, well, at any point really, we'll try to address those. Okay, thanks.
Hello, everyone. We're due to start the cpgk practical in a couple of minutes. Can I just get a show of hands for who is back from their break? Okay, it's around half. I might just wait a couple of minutes, or a minute or two. Okay, so I'm going to start with the cpgk QMM practical. Can everyone hear me okay and see my slides? I can't see the chat, so I'll quickly switch back.
Yeah, I can hear you okay, and I can see your slides.
Awesome. Okay, so this practical is kind of going to follow on a bit from the GROMACS practical. So we're going to look a bit more at using hybrid mode, so MPI plus OpenMP. We're also going to be running a molecular dynamics simulation, albeit a very, very short one. So yeah, it's going to expand on that a bit more. We're going to look at profiling within cpgk. So cpgk has its own profiling report, so we can get a bit of information from this about what subroutines are using a certain amount of time, and in particular, we're going to look at some of the communication subroutines. So these are message passing routines. So these are done within the MPI library in cp2k, and we're going to look at their overheads and how these change when you're running on different numbers of threads and on multiple nodes as well. So we're going to move on to running on to 2 on 4 nodes, and maybe larger if you wish. We have a reservation for quite a few nodes, so you're welcome to go ahead and look at scaling further out. So yeah, these are the few aims. I've kind of discussed these. So we're going to run a QMM simulation using cpgk on multiple nodes with MPI and OpenMP, and we'll look at the effect of threading across multiple nodes. We're going to kind of dive into why you might be seeing some of these effects and why certain numbers of threads might work better than others. And yeah, we'll kind of discuss that and also look at some of the communications overheads and how they are affected by using threads and running on multiple nodes. We'll look at profiling cp2k, so what we can actually profile and why it's useful. So cp2k is really good in that it prints a nice profiling report at the end of each run. But you can achieve this with other codes, and the other codes do similar things, and you can also profile using specific profiling tools such as CROPAT and others. Yeah, and we'll think about different overheads that can limit the scaling. So this is a bit of overview of a QMM simulation within cp2k. So this is doing a quantum mechanical molecular modeling simulation, which is what those letters stand for. So you're basically taking a small region of the simulation and using QM on this region, and everything else is using classical ND. So this might be if you have a particular region of interest where you want to improve the accuracy above using classical molecular dynamics. But you don't want to use QM everywhere because it's much, much more costly than using regular classical molecular modeling, as we'll see in this exercise, and the fact that this takes way longer than doing the GROMACS exercise, which had multiple ND steps. And here we're just shrinking down and using one ND step just because of how long it will take, and we're a bit strapped for time. So yeah, example of this might be when you have a protein within a liquid. So yeah, say for a protein within water is a very typical example. And in this case, we'll be looking at a green fluorescent protein within water. So yeah, the QM energy is calculated using density functional theory. You don't need to worry about that too much, but cpgk uses the quick step method. This is a mixture of Gaussians and plane wave basis sets. So yeah, it's just how it calculates the energy in this particular QM region. And then the coupling is handled with the Gaussian expansion of the electrostatic potential, which is the GEEP method. So this is a little overhead about cp2k. So it does atomistic simulations, mainly using density functional theory. It has a lot of support for other methods. You can find information about it on its website. There's a big list of features. Some are quite a lot of features. So this is a quick overhead. So it does energy and forces. You can do optimization such as geometry optimization and the nodule elastic band method, which is good for looking at like reaction pathways and energy barriers. It also does molecular dynamics, as we'll be running today. It can calculate different properties as well, such as charges, vibrational spectra, and frequency calculations. So what we're going to be looking at today, we're going to be running a molecular dynamics simulation of this green fluorescent protein, and we have 20 QM atoms in this case. This is just a particular size. I've also provided an input for the same system, but with 77 QM atoms. So more atoms, basically using this more costly method. You can also find more information about cpgk and particularly the QMM part of it using, if you look at QMM best practice guide, and I've provided the link there. This is kind of under development at the moment, but there's still quite a lot of useful information there. So cpgk provides this profiling report at the end. So you can see here, it will list the subroutines that have been called within running cpgk and say some information about them. So I've got a list of all the subroutines here. cpgk is the whole thing, so this will give you the time for running the whole code. And you can see here, it prints the number of calls, the average stack depth, which you don't really need to worry about, but you can kind of see that cpgk itself is a stack depth of 1. It's called at the highest level, and then as this number increases, these routines are called further down. And then these two columns here are the self time. So this is the runtime of the particular function. You want to be looking, when you're doing your profiling work, you want to be looking at these columns here, particularly the maximum value. So the total time is basically the time within the routine and everything else called within it. So it's not really helpful if you're want to look at the runtime of a particular routine itself on its own. And then you have average and maximum printed here. So average is the average of each of the ranks that have called that particular routine. And then the maximum is the maximum time of all the ranks. So yeah, you think these times might be the same, but they're actually different, and the maximum will be usually larger than the average all the time. And this is because you have slight load imbalance between the different ranks. So if you see here, if you were to see a large difference between the average and the maximum, this might indicate a really bad load imbalance. So you've got basically one rank that's taking way longer than the average to complete this routine. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. We won't be looking at this too much today. When you're doing this, I'd report the time for the maximum, because this is in fact the actual whole time that's been taken to complete the routine. Okay, so on to the exercise. So yeah, basically I'll move on to the instructions now, because this will just say what the instructions are. So first step is to download the required files. So yeah, basically we're going to be running the system, so you need to get the files here. I've also placed them in the shared directory under shared QMM cpgk practical, and then you can download and extract them. The first part of the exercise will be focusing on this input file here. So this is the smaller of the two systems with your 20 QM atoms. So this QMM1.imp is the main cpgk input file, and this is what you'll have to specify in your job script when you're running these. You also have this topology file here. So this is an Amber style topology, which is called for doing the topology and force fields for the MM part of your simulation. And then also this file here, which is a restart file. It basically contains restart information, such as the atomic coordinates and velocities. So we're starting from an equilibrated system. This is what you'd usually do in a production run. So yeah, you basically need to put all these in the same directory together. All of these these two file names are both specified within the QMM1 input file. So it will be looking to read these files in when you run the job. Yeah, and you'll have to create a job script for running these. I've actually placed one within the shared directory as well in part 1. I can provide links to that. But yeah, so you need to, if you're going by this example here, you'll just need to make some small changes. So you need to make sure that you're setting these variables correctly. So it should be similar as in the last exercise, where you want to ensure task per node and CPUs per task are multiplying together to give 128, and that your CPUs per task is equal to the number of threads. And then, yeah, you'll need to specify the input file here, which is the qmm1.imp. And the reservation and account number. I provided a fully done one within the shared directory. So basically, the first part will just be to run this on a single node. So we're looking at MPI plus OpenMP again. We'll set nodes equal to 1 in the job script, and then go through and set these variables. So we're starting with threads equal to 1 and 128 tasks per node, and then go through and increase threads to 2, 64 tasks per node. So there's some instructions here about how you can easily extract the time information from your output file. So this will be whatever you've specified the output to be. And we're also going to have a look at these message passing routines. So these start with MP at the start of them. So they'll be found in this calling list, and you can run a grep command here, which finds these within your output file. So you should get something. Should get some timings for MPI all-to-all, MP sum, and MP wait any. So these are what I found so far, and then just record the self-time maximum. So here I've provided a table like this. I've also put this table into the Etherpad if people want to fill in some of the results. So yes, make sure you're setting the CPUs per task, the tasks per node, and the number of threads correctly. And I think that's everything for the first part. I'll do a bit of a summary in about 20 past, maybe, or maybe a bit longer if people need more time. But yeah, but this is an hour-long session, so I want to break it up a little bit. Okay, cool. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions either in the chat or in the Etherpad.
Hey everyone, there's a question in chat about finding the files in shared. Holly's uploaded the cp2k files in the local shared file for the budget code TA017. So you can find them in /work/TA017/TA017/shared. If anyone needs access to them at the higher level shared, let me know and we'll copy them across, or let us know and we'll copy them. Hey everyone, just wanted to mention that we spotted a typo, which has now been fixed, on the original schedule shown on the GitHub page for the course. Originally, lunch was written down as being at 10 past 12 UK time, so 10 past 1 EU time, CEST. We've now changed the mistake. It should instead be at 40 past 12 GMT, so in another 25 minutes. Hope that's okay.
Yeah, just to clarify, that's consistent with the schedule on the course page on the ARCHER2 website. So just a mistake was in the GitHub page rather than in the yeah, so it's correct in the the ARCHER2 website.
So I've just noticed who's ever has added their time in the Etherpad. Sorry, I forgot to mention the time for cpgk. Instead of taking the self time, you should take the total time. So the one at the very end, the max total time. So yeah, it's just a bit of a weird, peculiar way that cpgk measures times. So for that one, you need to take the total time because that's getting the time from everything that's been used. Thanks. Yeah, I didn't explain that very well. So for the first part, when running on one process, you can see a lot of people reported that you're getting an out of memory error. This is in fact correct. Well, this is in fact what I see, and yeah, there's nothing going wrong here. There's just that on one thread on ARCHER2, there's not enough memory to run this calculation. So when you're running with one thread, you have 128 processes, and each of these get a fair share of the memory per node. So I think it works out to like roughly 2 gigabytes per process. And then, yeah, so for this particular calculation, this isn't not enough memory per process. So you get this out of memory error. You'll find if you've already started running on 2 threads, you don't get this error. And this is because we have 64 processes in this case, so 2 threads and 64 processes. And each process has a larger share of the memory, well, kind of roughly double the share in this case. And yeah, therefore, there's enough memory and we don't see this out of memory error. So yeah, this is just one of the ways that using MPI and OpenMP, yeah, as it usually has less memory requirements. So I'll give you a bit more time to fill in some of the results in the table there, and yeah, let me know if you're having any issues and post any questions in the chat or in the Etherpad. Yeah, so also don't worry if you don't see all of these routines on some particular configurations. What cpgk does is report the fraction of like the most costly routines, and sometimes not all of these are seen. So I've picked these 3 out as these are the 3 that I was most often seeing when I was running this search for the MP message passing routines in the timing report. But you might not see these all the time just because of how things run. The time might be smaller, and then in that case, cpgk won't bother report it. You might see some extra ones occasionally. So I think there might be a wait all sometimes pops up as well. But yeah, don't worry too much if you don't see the same ones all the time. Just report what you have. So yeah, it kind of looks like we've got some good results for that one so far. So yeah, maybe so you can kind of see so far, based on the results we have, that using 4 threads is the fastest, and it's quite fairly like the big difference is like 30 seconds, no, 20, 30 seconds. So yeah, 4 threads looks to be most optimum time-wise. And then looking at communications as well. So the communications are doing kind of different interesting things, right? So you can see for MP all-to-all, this is going down from 2 threads to 4 threads, and then back up again. And then MP sum is kind of just going down with threads. Yeah, MP weight only is doing interesting things. I can't quite work out. Okay, so for which value of threads is the overall communication time the least? So what you might consider doing is summing up the time for all these different message passing routines that have been found. So this was what I had in the original instruction sheet, but might be fiddly to do on the fly at the moment. So yeah, if you sum up the contribution for all the different message passing routines reported here, you can kind of work out an estimation of, yes, small amount, yes, the lower amount, so the most performant, I guess. And then if you start looking at 32 threads, you can see that the time has shot way up compared to the other values. So this is kind of similar to what we were looking at in the GROMACS exercise, where we had we were looking at NUMA regions. So basically 32 threads here, the threads will be spanning across 2 NUMA regions. So when threads are sharing memory between each other, they can be accessing across different NUMA regions, and this can slow down memory accesses and slow down the total runtime altogether. So yeah, we're gonna have lunch soonish. So people are happy to continue looking at that part of the exercise. I was also going to suggest, if you're keen, the next part of this exercise is quite similar. We're just looking at then repeating this on 2 nodes and 4 nodes. So if you wanted to, you can maybe submit a job or 2, and then they can run over lunchtime just to like speed things up a little bit and in the break. So yeah, all the results are quite similar to each other, which is good. Okay, so I think we're about to break for lunch. I've added in the Etherpad, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see there's the space to put in timing reports for the second part of the exercise. Yeah, so this is just very similar to the last part. I've taken out doing 32 threads in this case because it's quite slow, and I don't know if we'll see anything really interesting from that. But yeah, if you could just go ahead and look again for 2 nodes and 4 nodes, and then we can see the effect of how the most performant, see what effects multi-threading has on different numbers of nodes, and whether the best performing number of threads is the same as you increase the number of nodes. But yeah, I think we'll finish for lunch now. So there'll be a second part of this exercise this afternoon, and yeah, it's time for you to have a look at this between now and then if you're keen, or we can resume during the exercise this afternoon. And we'll start back at 20 to 2, so 1:40. Is that right?
I think it's 1:30.
Okay, yes, you're right, it's 1:30.
Okay, thanks. Right, welcome back everyone, or at least I think welcome back. Let's do the thing where we just put hands up to see, to let me know if you are back. Okay, about half. I'll just give it another minute or so. Okay, well, those who aren't here yet, you can follow along later by video on YouTube in recording. So the idea now is to talk, well, the title of the talk is The Future of HPC, which sounds very grandiose. Basically, we're going to look at some of the trends in HPC, looking back at sort of how we got where we are now, what the machines that are available to use are like now, which we've shown you what they're like now, and also we'll look ahead at sort of what we expect to be coming. We'll say something about exascale, which is something that is a term that's used a lot in HPC, and just so you know what it means. And we'll talk about some of the challenges that are involved as well. So hopefully this will be useful for you to figure out, when you're using machines, what the technologies are, and how new machines in particular, when they're coming, don't suddenly surprise you with something that is completely alien to you. So we'll look at some of the underlying hardware. We'll focus in particular on what we've already focused on so far, which is what's key for performance, which is the processors and the memory. Talk about accelerators as well, and how these are put together. So looking at kind of the trends in that and how that's expected to evolve over the next few years. So eventually, and how eventually we'll see that being taken up in machines that become available for you to use. So that's kind of the hardware side, and we'll also highlight a little bit some of the software challenges that, in any case, the developers of software need to face. Whether you need to care about these if you're using software but not developing it is another question. But as with everything else that we've talked about when it comes to software, it's useful to know at least what some of the challenges are, even if you're not the programmer solving them, because then you can understand better maybe what the performance is or how to use the software on a new machine. So let's start by looking at sort of architectures and the hardware that makes up HPC machines. So let's have a look at a couple of sort of key performance aspects of that characterize HPC machines. So in particular, we already said that the number of floating point operations that a processor can perform per second is important, because a lot of scientific computing is numerical computing, means doing lots of maths with real numbers, doing lots of floating point operations. So that matters. And if you think of it as if you ask the question, what is the total number of floating point operations per second that the entire machine, so all the processors on the machine, can do if they were all running at the same time, then that is this first metric, this first line here that we're looking at, the system performance. There's also a difference between the theoretical performance that a system could yield based on the individual floating point, based on the individual floating point performance of all the processors. But we already talked about how if you're running something in parallel, the processors are going to have to talk to each other. So they won't be running all the time flat out, because they're going to have to wait sometimes to talk to each other. So we already know that the theoretical peak performance of a machine probably isn't going to be the theoretical peak performance of a machine is in an ideal situation the sum of the theoretical peak performances of all the processors in it. But in reality, that's not true. It's always a bit less. Depends very much on what you run and how much communication is involved. But the key thing is that this metric of the number of floating point operations per second has been used over the past number of decades to kind of define what era or scale of supercomputing we're in. So purely with reference to the total number of floating point operations per second, or flops, that a computer can perform. So 2016, we were in an era where the average machine, the average HPC machine could perform, say, or maybe not the average, the top 10 say, HPC machines, the biggest ones, could perform around 100 petaflops. And looking forward from a few years ago towards 2020, then we expected, okay, in 2020 we'll probably have a machine that can perform 1 exaflop, so 10 to 18 floating point operations per second. So we'll look in a second at whether that's actually come true or not. But the thing about this comparison is that it shows was an extrapolation into the future, now the present, of trends in the processor technology, but also the memory. So as you can see, we expect that the trends in development of HPC is that the total amount of memory that you get goes up gradually over time. So we expect to have more floating point operations on each node as well. So that is to say that a given node can do more floating point operations, which means that the balance in communication versus computation is changing over time. Because if each node can do a lot more floating point operations, does it still need to talk to other nodes? Yes, probably. So unless the network also improves along with the increase in performance of the floating point operations of each node, then there's going to be, if the network doesn't improve as in proportion, then that is going to be a bottleneck that will stop you actually obtaining overall good performance, even despite each individual node having quite increased performance. The concurrency, which is simply a measure of the number of threads or processes that applications would be expected to use or need to use, is also expected to increase. We expect the bandwidth of the interconnect to increase. That's this proportionality I was talking about. The number of nodes we expect to increase. So basically everything we expect to increase, except for MTTI, which is the mean time to interrupt, or mean time to failure. So this would be the time you need to wait that on average for between cases where some hardware failure occurs. For example, a node in the system has a hardware failure, and that actually is expected to go down. Why? Because if you get more nodes and you assume everything else being equal, that nodes fail because hardware fails at a certain rate, hopefully a very low rate, but it happens. And as your system is bigger, there's more nodes, then the chance, all else being equal, that a node fails on any given day is larger, so the mean time between nodes failing is shorter. So that's one thing. The power is also expected to increase, but as you see, we know that so the power doesn't increase that much. It increases a bit. That's good because supercomputers take a hell of a lot of electricity to run, and the problem is if you're saying that over the course of 10 years or however many years it takes, you're going to get 10 times and 100 times and 1,000 times as much computing power. If the electricity requirements were also to grow a factor 10, 100,000, you would be completely unable to meet that demand with the power provision in basically anywhere, unless you build it right next to a big nuclear reactor, and even then, eventually, you run out of that scale. So this was the prediction in the trend. So let's look at whether that's actually held true or not. So I'll just go to something that people in HPC often refer to, which is called the top 500. So the top 500 is a list. It's a list of machines, supercomputing machines. In fact, there's 3 different lists. There's the classic top 500, which is a ranking of machines on the basis of a particular way of measuring their performance. Namely, it's measuring that their floating point performance, the overall floating point performance of the entire machine. So that's when nothing else is running on it. This is computed by running a particular kind of benchmark, which does linear algebra. There are 2. So you see here a list of the systems, and there's 2 columns, Rmax and Rpeak. our peak is the theoretical performance that you would get if you thought of all the processors being running flat out, each with their individual peak theoretical performance. Our max is the actual floating point operations per second that you achieve with this benchmark running on the entire system. Now, it can be fairly close, and actually it's a criticism of the benchmark that it is a bit artificial. It's a bit of an artificial way of measuring and ranking systems because it doesn't reflect, it makes very good use of the processors because actually there's less communication and less stressing of the memory bandwidth than lots of real scientific software. So it's kind of maybe not an accurate representation of the real useful performance, but still it's a ranking and it provides us some insight into some big machines. So let's look at this. It gets refreshed every 6 months with contributions of public machines that are available and are willing to run this benchmark and get listed. So let's look at the biggest ones. Here's the top 10. They're ranked in terms of their performance. So this here, this corresponds to essentially half an exaflop. So thinking back to our list, we're not at 1 exaflop, we're at half an exaflop. Close enough. I mean, it's getting there. With regards to the memory, that's not mentioned here, but I happen to know that this number 1 machine here, just take one example, has 5 petabytes and are looking forward comparisons at 10 petabytes. So, okay, not too far off. The concurrency, it has 7 million cores, which is a high amount of concurrency. There's only one machine here, I think, has higher, which is the Sunway Taihu Lite in China. So that's a number of cores. These are very, very. So yeah, so whether you're judging multi-core concurrency versus accelerated concurrency, they're not quite the same thing because the GPU cores are very, very small. But okay, that's maybe it's gone up, clearly increased a lot. So looking back at, so it's interesting to note actually that, and we'll come back to this, that number 1 here is quite unique in terms of what its architecture is. So it is the chip that it had, the processor is A64FX, which I'll say something about in a minute. You can see a lot of the other systems are a combination of either, I think there's an AMD EPYC machine here as well, number 5, just like ARCHER2, combined with a GPU, NVIDIA A100 GPU. And then here's some IBM machines that also include NVIDIA Volta GPUs. Then there's some others. So the very common pattern at the moment is some Intel or AMD processor or IBM CPU multi-core processor with an additional accelerator, often NVIDIA. So going back to our slides. So I'm not going to comment on the interconnect speed and how that is reflected in the current ranking, but let's talk in a little bit more detail. So the way that processors clearly are developing is that we're getting more floating point operations power per processor, and we already know that's not happening because the clock speed is increasing. It's happening because of processors having more cores and exploiting other kinds of things like SIMD vectorization, SMT, which we also talked about, and so so software needs to use these more cores somehow. We also talked about memory bandwidth being so important, and that is also set to develop and improve in processors. And in fact, the current number 1 machine on the top 500, the Fugaku machine that I highlighted, is a very good example of the role of memory bandwidth. Because its processors, the ARM A64FX, which is actually produced by Fujitsu, based on licensed design by ARM, it was designed over a long process with a lot of effort. It was designed, first of all, specifically for HPC. So a lot of the other processors are designed, maybe for larger markets like general data center use, and then tweaked to incorporate some features that are useful for HPC. But the Fujitsu ARM A64FX was really developed for HPC. They really looked in detail at the real needs of software running on these machines, the precursor machines, what their memory bandwidth requirements are. So it has very high bandwidth memory. It's actually stacked in 3 dimensions, so that it's quicker for memory in any part of the data in any part of the memory to get to the cores. So it can feed its cores very quickly. And by the way, it has, each A64FX has 48 cores. It has double precision performance of about 3 teraflops. And that is in comparison, as we'll see in a moment. It'll be interesting to compare that to GPUs. It has excellent power efficiency, a lot better than other multi-core processors, and even somewhat comparable maybe to GPUs. And the nice thing is that you don't need to modify CPU code in the ways that we've talked about to modify your software to actually use them. Unlike for GPUs, you can just run it. So I said that, so processors and accelerators, as I already pointed out, accelerators are very common, and as you'll see a bit later today when we talk about the newer systems becoming available in the UK and the EU, accelerators are very common. So ARCHER2 doesn't have any accelerators, but they are very common, increasingly widespread. So NVIDIA has been market dominant. AMD is coming out with them as well, and these are being taken up increasingly in HPC machines because they're real number crunchers. They offer excellent floating point performance per watt, so the energy efficiency is very good. What it means is that if you have 1, 2, 3, or 4 GPUs per node, there is a lot of computing power in a node. So this is going back to the point that I was making about nodes getting more powerful, or they're sometimes called fatter because they have both more memory and more compute power. So the challenge is that being able to feed this compute power well enough through the memory bandwidth. And just to think about when we talk about both processors and accelerators, thinking about why the processors that exist, it's because of the investment that's made by big companies like Intel and NVIDIA, AMD, into designing and fabricating these chips, which is a multi-year. It takes many years to plan and takes massive investments. And so what HPC has always done for scientific and engineering computing is, it is a market, but it's a smaller market compared to, say, all data centers, big data centers, the Googles and the tech companies of this world, and also nowadays cars, the market for cars, autonomous driving in future. All of these are markets for which there's a lot of money floating around, and there's a lot of the chips are designed for those applications, and so HPC, scientific computing using HPC, has been piggybacking a lot of the chip development that's been not necessarily optimized for HPC specifically. In the past, for example, GPUs emerged for gaming, so, or for graphics rendering and gaming, and then they were taken up and tweaked to really be suitable for HPC because they were so good at numerical computing. So similarly, what's happening at the moment, the past couple of years, past few years, and still continuing, is that chips being developed for AI, which is just a massive market, are being leveraged for HPC. So the GPUs themselves that NVIDIA produces have kind of gone from being optimized for gaming to being optimized for gaming and also doing HPC, then being optimized for AI, which you could argue is a subset of the needs for scientific HPC, as AI also and machine learning, etc., becomes more relevant in scientific computing. So that's useful. But my point is that that's kind of what drives the hardware. And if we look at one of the recent NVIDIA GPUs as an example, the A100, the Ampere GPU, which I think came out sometime last year, the performance that it offers, a single one of them, is with regard to the standard GPU cores that it has, about 10 teraflops. And if you use specific cores that were designed, optimized for training neural networks for machine learning, you can get 20 teraflops. So compare that if we look back at A64FX of 3 teraflops, then yeah, okay, it is more, but the A64FX is not doing bad at all for a 48-core multi-core processor without requiring additional effort in developing the code to use GPUs. So that's pretty good. It's just interesting to have that in mind as a comparison. So that's processors and accelerators. we already know memory is important, and I said memory bandwidth in particular is important. So memory bandwidth is important is because you need to make sure the processors are kept fed, so to speak, to churn through stuff, which relies on both memory and interconnects. But moving data around the memory hierarchy is costly. It's costly in terms of time, but also costly in terms of electricity. So that's partly responsible for some of the improving the location of data in memory that's close to where it needs to be computed is one of the keys to improving the power efficiency of processors and accelerators for HPC. So the expectation is that the memory hierarchy will become a little bit more complex. So what you might be used to is the picture I outlined, which is, you've got disk, and you've got RAM, and you've got your processor, and that's it. But I think Julian already mentioned that ARCHER2, for example, will be expected to have an additional layer that's SSD, and this is already present in several machines globally, and it's becoming increasingly interesting. So what's being put in fact, is then an additional one or more additional layers of memory that are in between disk and RAM. So that they persist. So they're unlike RAM. You can store data in them, and they won't just last while an application is running. You can store, actually, it can stay there. But it's faster than much faster than disk. So NVRAM is one example. NVRAM is non-volatile RAM, so it means that the data can be stored there, or SSD, solid-state drives. So these sit somewhere in between. Just as a picture, the picture will change from the top, which is what we showed before, to the picture below, which means with some additional memory hierarchy. And some of this may be hidden from you as a user of software. If you're a programmer, you certainly have to think about it, but you may be forced, even when it comes to scheduling jobs in the system, to choose which layer you want your data, where you want your data to live, and which layer you want to put it. And one of the reasons for putting these layers in is because it's a combination of realizing the energy cost, the effect on performance for traditional HPC workloads, but also because if you want to do increasing role of machine learning in scientific high performance computing, that means there's a lot of data. There's more data maybe than there was before, and making this available to use to train neural networks. And for example, you could have an HPC simulation generating data, which you then want to train models on, and you might like that to be accessible, to have that in a layer that's high bandwidth, low latency, close to processors and accelerators, rather than having it live on disk and having to reload it every time you want to train stuff. So that flexibility is coming in. It's something you might encounter as you use new machines. So another trend is that the components that I outlined as being separate, the processor, the memory, etc., are increasingly going to be combined onto a single chip. And actually, this kind of mirrors what happened in the past. It's kind of deja vu, because what happened in the past, that I showed you the picture of what is a processor. Well, what is a single core processor? Even a single core processor, we said, had all these different functional units: floating point unit, integer unit, a control unit. And actually, back in the day, and the day being the 70s, 80s, at some point, these functional units would be independent things you would plug into the motherboard. But then at some point, they got packaged together into a single chip, namely a central processing unit, processor, which is good because it means that it reduces the latency between the components, and also improves power efficiency. And if you want to see a kind of something you might be familiar with, if you're keeping up to date with particular hardware developed by Apple, laptops and stuff, they've recently switched from Intel processors to their own Apple Silicon design, and they're one of the reasons why it's really fast and it's really low power consumption, and that's because it moved stuff onto a chip. Of course, when you lock stuff down like that, it means you cannot, there's less scope for customization. A manufacturer cannot combine this interface with this memory and this, and combine it as much as possible, have as much flexibility as possible. But actually, you maybe don't care, because for HPC, you're happy to, for a vendor to optimize everything, design everything together, and then if it performs well and it's low energy use, that's great. So we've talked about hardware, the hardware side of things, and let's look a little bit the flip side, on the software side of things, so what is software that you come across and use need to do in the future to exploit the HPC hardware? So kind of reiterating, the additional complexity in the memory hierarchy that will be there. One of the things that trends that's also happening is if you look at the amount of memory per node, say, and the number of cores per node, including accelerators, then the amount of memory per node might go down. So that could present challenges. What's nice, as we saw today in the practicals, is that if you have a flexible programming, if the software you're using is flexible because it has both MPI and OpenMP, so it can do shared memory and distributed memory. What that means is, as Holly mentioned, you can maybe choose to have more threads or fewer threads, so that the memory requirements per task and therefore per core are different, which means you can make use of hardware that you maybe otherwise couldn't. So that's very useful. So that's going to continue to play a role in the software. And in fact, some of the algorithms may need to change, and this has been true throughout the history of high-performance computing, because as we've tried to make clear in the course, high-performance computing is kind of the holy grail, is perfect parallel computing, that everything is 100% efficient. But really, everything is processors are in individual cores not getting any faster. In fact, any individual cores are getting slower. So to make your code run faster, or even as fast as it used to, it needs to be better at using parallelism. So in terms of the whole flow of our equations that we're trying to solve, what the models we're trying to be solved, being formulated mathematically, then algorithms being developed to solve that maths or to simulate the maths, and then to put that into software to run on computers. The algorithms themselves, whereas they used to be in the past all chosen to be as fast as possible, running in thinking about running a single execution stream, so on a single core. Now software should really look at using algorithms that might run slower on one or just a small number of cores, but ultimately have more scope for parallelization. And that'll be the real way of trying to eliminate this Amdahl's law serial fraction, which stands in the way of the theoretical optimal parallel performance. So that will be something to keep in mind. So if you see a piece of software that says, I'm using an algorithm that solves the same problem you're interested in, but does it in a way that will scale better in future, then you think, okay, that's good. Let me invest my time and effort in learning that, using that, because that'll bear more fruit in future. Mixed precision will become more important because, for example, the GPUs that are specialized for machine learning, they sometimes don't care about having double precision. They use single precision or half precision, so less decimal places basically in the maths. And because if you're training a neural network model, it doesn't really matter. You don't care that much. So software like GROMACS, for example, is nice because it knows how to take advantage of single precision to give you an answer of a required accuracy. So it's very flexible. So software will also need to make use of that. And ultimately, so libraries are very useful because they try to take care of providing some, do the Fourier transform or do this kind of computation, linear algebra, multiply two matrices, things like that. They try to take care of how to do so fast on hardware. So those libraries need to develop to be optimized for example, accelerators that are optimized for AI, so that software can in turn make use of those libraries to get good performance from future hardware. How about if you've got applications that don't scale, or applications that are examples where they're not these tightly coupled things that, but are just very much independent tasks that can run independently? You can still benefit from larger HPC machines because obviously there's more nodes, more cores, but you might be caught out by this if you're having less memory per core. There are ways of exploiting larger number of cores effectively by doing increased sampling. In the case of biomolecular simulation, for using MD, there's approaches for that, and using more statistical method or advanced statistical techniques, basically changing your thinking about how you use the parallelism that's available. That should be a way of exploiting parallelism too. We're talking about HPC, but actually these trends I've described are very general about computing, because actually our mobile phones now are parallel computers as well. They're just, they have more than one core. They have multi-core processors. So this is true about software and hardware actually in general. So it's useful to know about. Just a quick note about a couple of things we've not really touched on in the course so far, which is the role of cloud computing versus HPC. Now, traditionally, a lot of cloud computing didn't really provide the kind of high-performance interconnect, in particular, to enable these tightly coupled applications to run well. In the last couple of years, that's changed. So, like for example, Microsoft Azure offers instances of high-performance computing type cloud computing. So it can be useful, but you might still be likely to pay more than for on-site computing. So there's pros and cons. I already mentioned containers. So in the previous talk, so containers are coming to play a bigger role in making it easier to have the freedom to deploy customizable environment and to share that environment and receive it from for example, as we saw, to be able to run workflows that are defined and to be able to deploy those on wherever you decide to run it, whether it's on your laptop or whether it's on a high-performance computer like ARCHER2. So these are very useful. Okay, so there's a quick overview of trends that got us here and trends in the next couple of years. Hopefully this is helpful to help you understand both the machines you're encountering now and what you might encounter in future and how best to make use of them. So just for running over a bit, if there are maybe any quick questions, or feel free to put a question in the text. I think I'll hand over to Holly to take us on to continuing the practical.
Okay, so basically we're just going to pick up where we left off with the cpgk practical. So moving on to looking at MPI plus OpenMP on multiple nodes and filling in these results for the total runtime of cpgk and the communication times. Lots of people have been adding stuff to the Etherpad, which is really good. If you look at the Etherpad, I've added an extra column here. I've kind of squashed it into the end for timecom. So if you have the chance, it'd be good if you could try and sum up the time for the MP contributions. So just the time for MP all, MP sum, and MP weight any, and just add it to that final column. That will help you in the next part of the exercise. So yeah, I've added, the next part is just be carrying on filling those. If you've already done all that or you're getting towards the end, there's just a few questions. So to fill in and having a look at the effect of threading across multiple nodes. And then the next part is looking at communication overheads. So it's just no more runs need to be taken, but just looking at some of the numbers and the data that you have. So looking at the runtime of these routines as the number of threads are increased, and then calculating the fraction of total time spent doing communications. So this is, if you take this, once you've summed up the time for the different communications, and then dividing that by the time total, and just having a look at that as the number of nodes is increased. So I guess you can just take one value of threads for this. You don't have to do it all the way through. But yeah, if there's any questions, pop them in the chat or the Etherpad. But yeah, I'll leave you to get on with that, and I'll be adding some data to the Etherpad as well.
Just in case anyone's interested, I've added a note to the Etherpad with links to the EPI, which is the European Processor Initiative. So the EU is also looking at the future of HPC. The EU is also funding the development of design and fabrication of processor technology in EU member states. So there's a company called SciPearl I've also linked to, that's been set up to get this going. So that's looking ahead. So you maybe in a number of years, who knows, you might ultimately find a machine that runs one of those processors if something emerges from that project.
Okay, hello everyone. So it looks like we've got quite a few results in the table now, and in the interest of time before the break, I'm just going to quickly summarize things. So let me share my screen. So yeah, looking down the Etherpad, you can see all the results. So you can see the time total. Looking at this and the number of threads, you can see, so it looks like 4 threads is best on 2 nodes in this case, so that's got the shortest runtime. And then on 4 nodes, looking at everyone's results, so this is 8 threads, which is the fastest. So yeah, there's a bit of a change here. So you notice back on our 1 node results, it was 4 threads again. So yeah, it's a switch between 4 threads and 8 threads being faster on 4 nodes. I guess you could kind of convince yourself that on 8 nodes you're using more and more processors because you're using more cores, and therefore if you switch to using threads, a larger number of threads, you end up with like more like message aggregation, so it might reduce the communication overheads overall. And you can kind of see that as well with the results for communications that we've taken here for MPI tool. Other parts of the code as well might also benefit from threading. So you might see areas within the code where threading's been added where it might not have been straightforward to add in MPI because of the fact that you have to distribute the data over the processes. So there are certainly areas within this example where some subroutines seem to really benefit from having threading in them and using more threads. Yeah, and then looking at the communications, you can see it kind of matches what's going on with the overall runtime. So I have my results slides that I'll quickly share. So here are some results I made earlier. So yeah, this covers what we discussed on the single node. So yeah, 4 threads was the best here, and we looked at 32 threads and said that was very slow. So threading on multiple nodes, I've plotted here the total runtime versus cores for the different thread numbers, and then you can see here this switch over between 4 and 8 threads. So 4 threads becomes better on 8 nodes, and then yeah, more threads means less processes overall, and as processes are sending messages, there's potential for less communication overheads. And areas may exploit threading in some parts, so that can help speed it up. Basically, the takeaway here is it's always a good idea to run tests to see what value is best. It's very hard to like predict what would even happen, based on just doing a few results. So it's good to take on different numbers of nodes to have a look at multi-threading and find what that value of threads would be better. It can make quite a stark difference, and particularly as you move to higher core counts, potential for using MPI plus OpenMP can help improve the scaling. So the other thing I asked about was communications. So I had a look at how MP sum and MP all to all fare with the number of threads. So here I've got a graph. I think this was taken on 4 nodes of just the number of threads and the runtime for these different routines. So yeah, for some you can see it clearly, the runtime clearly decreases with the number of threads, and this might be due to the fact that less messages are being sent as you're using more threads and less processes. Yeah, MPI all to all is less clear. So first time I ran it, I saw something like this that kind of went down for 2 threads and then back up for 16 and then down again for 32. So yeah, it's a bit interesting. But yeah, again, sort of 2 to 4 threads range looks to be optimal. So yeah, it's really difficult to predict how these routines will behave and how the code as a whole will behave when you're changing them as threads. So it's difficult to know whether the runtime is going to be improved or get worse. So this is something you really have to test if you're interested in it and interested in getting the best performance. Yeah, MPI all-to-all and MP-sum in this case are both basically doing all reducers. So I don't really understand why they're so different, but yeah, it's interesting. And I had a look at the code and it still wasn't clear to me. So yeah, the last thing I asked was to look at the fraction of time spent in the message passing routines and plot this over the different nodes. So, oh, okay, I've plotted it here for different values of threads, so 2 threads, 4 threads, and 8 threads. And yeah, the takeaway message here is that this fraction increases with the number of nodes, so the more cores you're using. Basically, your communications are a bit of an overhead. So other areas of the code where you're doing sort of more numerical operations have the potential to speed up much more efficiently when you're using more and more cores. However, communications are kind of a bit more limited in this way. So as you use more and more cores, you see that the fraction of time that they take increases. It's just kind of a bit like Amdahl's law. So they're kind of limited, although they're not officially serial. They're sort of a part of the overhead that can be considered not to scale perfectly with the number of cores. So yeah, changing the number of threads has a bit of an effect on this fraction as well, as you can see in the graph. The last bit was like the extra exercise. I don't think anyone got onto this, but in case they did, this was just looking at the larger system. So you can see that this larger system scales better than the other one, but maybe not by as much as you think. Considering the QM region size is almost quadrupled, it's not, yeah, it's obviously limited by the MM region size as well. So it's not scaling 4 times as better, or yeah, scaling out more. Yeah, and then this system spends even larger amount of time doing communications compared to the small system. So you can imagine if you have a really large system, your fraction of time doing communications is going to be more limited. Okay, that's everything I have to say about that exercise. You're welcome to carry on working on it. We have the reservation until, I want to say 4, but is that right? I'll double check. But yeah, you're welcome to carry on working on it. The tunnel. Okay, 4 until 4. Yeah, so you're welcome to carry on working on the exercise. If you have any questions or anything, just pop them in the chat. I'll hand over. Oh no, we're having a break now, aren't we? I believe. Yes, break until 10 to, so 50 minutes past 2. So yeah, enjoy your break.
Hey everyone, could I please ask for a show of hands to see whether everyone has returned? And if enough people have returned, we'll get started. Brilliant, there's definitely enough people returned that we might as well start. For this final session, well, there's 2 sessions to go, but for this final part of the Intro to HPC for Life Scientists course, what we were wanting to do is talk about, well, start off by talking about the current HPC landscape in the EU and the UK, and describe what sort of levels of HPC computers there are, because we've talked a lot about this, and hopefully through this course you'll have noticed that there's there's many different ways to build a high-performing computer. So we wanted to talk a bit about that, and then talk a bit about where are good places to learn about what's available in the EU and in the UK. And after that, we'll finish with a review of the course. We'll give some ideas for where you could go next if you wanted to carry on, if you wanted to find further courses or even apply for time. And we'll finish by essentially being around and doing a bootstrapping session where Holly, Arno, and I will be happy to take any and all specific questions that you might have that are much more specific to the everyday computing and HPC problems that you might have, and try to give you help, solutions, ideas, that sort of thing, to make it much more relevant to you rather than overall relevant to what we think would be helpful for life scientists. So with that, let's talk a bit about the HPC landscape in the EU and the UK. So I'm going to start off by talking about the UK side of things, because we're going to start at the smallest level and then sort of build up, and then Arno will take over to talk about the EU side of things. So in the UK, and I think in most of Europe as well, but in the UK definitely, HPC facilities are divided into tiers. The larger HPC systems are categorized into higher tiers. In higher meaning, like 1 is higher than 3 sort of thing. So in the UK, there are 3 tiers of supercomputers available. You have tier 3 facilities, which are usually university supercomputers. So Arno, Holly, and I are based at the University of Edinburgh, and at the University of Edinburgh there is the Edinburgh ECDF, I think it is, the University of Edinburgh Compute Facility, and they have a high performance computer called Eddy. Eddy is much smaller than ARCHER2. It has about 7,000 Intel cores, as opposed to the final version of ARCHER2 is going to have around 750,000. So, we're talking 2 orders of magnitude difference here. But it's still classed as a high-performance computer and is a very good example of a tier 3 supercomputer. So it is a supercomputer. There is all of that technology that we talked about on the first day, but it's nowhere near as powerful as some of the larger ones, and it works perfectly well for a lot of university research. And indeed, it has certain advantages that, say, ARCHER2 doesn't, such as a much larger amount of memory available per compute node at 3 terabytes versus 256 gigs on ARCHER2. So I know a few people who would definitely for gene analysis, metagenomics, that sort of thing, Eddy's probably better to use than ARCHER2. Most UK universities have a local HPC facility, which is there for researchers at that university and also students at that university sometimes. And those are under the tier 3 umbrella, according to the tier system that I'm describing. Now, tier 2 facilities are a bit harder to define. It's a weird one. Tier 2 used to mean a regional facility. So there was a time where if there would be 6 tier 2 or 7 tier 2 facilities across the UK, and there would be like 1 per area of the UK. So there'd be 1 in Scotland, there'd be 1 in, say, the Midlands, in Wales, etc., etc., etc. And they would service that specific region. However, this is much less and less the case now than it was before. And now, frankly, the only real definition I can give for a tier 2 facility is that it's a facility which is open to researchers from around the UK. So unlike the university tier 3 HPCs, this one is open to anyone in the UK to apply to, and indeed sometimes there are people from outside the UK who can apply to these tier 2 facilities, but they're not powerful enough or large enough to be a tier 1 system. So one example that I will talk about is Cirrus. So Cirrus is that's the wrong one, isn't it? EPCC. Cirrus is a tier 2. Cirrus is a tier 2. There it is. That's one. Is a tier 2 that's also run by EPCC, and for this one, it's a larger system than EDI, which I've just shown you, insofar as it's got roughly what is it? It's got 270 nodes, each of which has 36 cores. So for those of you who can do maths quickly, that's about 10,000 cores total. So, and the cores are much more quick. It's also got, I think, around 200 GPUs now. So Holly can remind me of the numbers, but yeah, it's got a certain number. Actually, I can just look at the. Nope, that's Axis. Does it tell you? Yeah, so it has around, there it is, find out more about Cirrus. 280 nodes, which is what I mentioned. And then there are a certain number of them which are GPU nodes. So there are 36 GPU nodes, each GPU node having 4 GPUs for probably more like 144 than 200 GPUs. So again, there's a decent amount of computational power there, and it's much more powerful than EDI. However, it's not to the same level as ARCHER2 still. And so for ARCHER2, ARCHER2 falls into the tier 1 category, which are nationally leading centers. And usually most countries will have 1, maybe 2 in the country, and those are of the size that ARCHER2 is, so roughly speaking in the hundreds of thousands to millions of cores. Some of them will have also a number of GPUs there as well, and things like that. Now, one last thing that I forgot to mention about the tier 2 facilities is that these can be highly specialized. And actually, there's a great site for UK facilities. If you go on www.hpcuk.ac.uk. I'll put the link in the chat. Hopefully that one works. But if you go to that website, this is a site that collates all of the tier 2 and tier 1, or a lot of the tier 2 and tier 1 HPC facilities available in the UK. And it gives you information like what facilities there are. So ARCHER2's there, Cirrus, which I've just talked about. There's a couple of others which I've not talked about, some of which are more specialized for different things. For instance, Cambridge is for data-driven science. I believe CSD3 Bike is the one that's really good for metagenomics, but I might be misremembering here. And then there's a couple of other ones. So for instance, where is it? One of the systems, systems there, Jade, for instance, is entirely built. It's a tier 2 system that's been entirely built to help facilitate the research into machine learning and deep learning. So it's got a ton of GPUs, and it's, I can't remember if it's entirely GPUs, I think it might be, as opposed to the hybrids that Cirrus are, for instance, or the predominantly and at the moment only CPUs that ARCHER2 has. So sometimes you can get very highly specialized tier 2 facilities that are really there to focus on a single area of research or a single field of research. And then finally, there are a number of tier 0 systems, which are petaflop systems, and these should be amongst the best across a continent. So there's going to be no more than a handful of these per continent. This is getting into price territory, but I quickly wanted to just show this link, which is that in the EU through price, which Arno will talk about a bit more in a sec, there are only 7 tier 0 facilities, which is really a small number if you think about it, because Europe has a huge amount of money that does go into computational research. So to think that there's only 7 of these systems in the EU, in Europe, really emphasizes the point of quite how powerful and how big these machines might be, and are. And with that, I will hand over to Arno, who will talk a bit more about tier 0 systems and where you can find out more information about HPC in Europe, in the EU, and how to get access to it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think it's a good point that you made about the tier 2 systems in the UK, for example. So it's a nice strategy that's developed to make sure they're. I mean, it's not even necessarily the research area. It's very much the hardware that works well with particular software. And sometimes that might map onto research area, but I think that's important to realize. It's about the software working well on the particular hardware. When it comes to Trace, so in the EU context, this is the Trace website, and there's also some training which we can show you later. But let's have a look at actual systems. So if you go to HPC Access and then look under HPC Systems, you'll see what Julian was just showing. In fact, I think so. Actually, just 2 of these systems are actually tier 0. I think the other ones are a bit smaller. I think it's Pisdaint and Marconi that are the tier 0 systems. Yes, these are systems which individual EU member states have set up and at least partly paid for out of their own research infrastructure funding budgets, but they are made accessible and usable, and also access to researchers across the EU is partly funded by this partnership between member states for advanced research computing, i.e. PRACE. So to have a little bit of an idea what these systems are all about, well, let's have a look at the biggest ones first. Pisdaint. And so Pisdaint actually is actually quite high on the top 500. It's been around for a while, but it is currently still even on 12th position. So it is really quite sizable. Now there's some summary here in these descriptions of the hardware and architecture, which is useful to look at, but I can show you a table in a minute, which gives you an even better idea. But as you see already here, Pisdaint is a Cray system, and it has a GPU partition, which has not so powerful CPU cores than with GPUs added, and it also has a standard multi-core partition, which has slightly more powerful Intel Xeon multi-core processors. And the NVIDIA GPUs that it's got at the moment in the GPU partition are the P100s. Then let's have a look at Marconi. Yes, so that has IBM Power 9 processors and also NVIDIA Volta V100 GPUs. Let's actually have a look at, so this is very nice because it shows you all a description and nice pictures of the individual machines, but actually when it comes to getting an overview, it's easier if you look at somewhere else. So if you were to follow links for getting access to these systems, and I'll talk about that a bit later, then you will see that there is information about the systems, which we can have a look at. And so here there is a nice overview of the types of systems the hardware and architectures that are available. So if you have a look at the you can see the processor types. Well, there's AMD EPYC, which we're familiar with, and 1, 2, 3 of the systems by now have AMD EPYC processors. And then GPUs, not that many of them actually have GPUs. So there's 3, and one of which has 3 different generations of the NVIDIA GPUs. So Pisdaint has the P100, which is a bit older. Then the Marconi has the Volta, which is more recent, and Jules Booster, the system here, as the Ampere A100, which is the newest system. And in fact, Jules Booster, which became operational only just very recently, is also quite high in the top 500. It's coming at number 7, so it's a lot of compute power that it has there. So that's a big system as well. So we've looked to the processors. We've said AMD EPYC has a few of those. There's a couple of there's one IBM Power 9 CPU, and these are becoming less common. Then there's some Intel Xeon Skylake, other Xeon, some other different generations of multi-core Intel Xeon with let's see, does it say number of cores per node? No, well, you can work it out by dividing the total number of cores by the total number of nodes. But the total number of cores is also something interesting to look at. Oh, you're not seeing. Oh, hang on a second. Oh, I see what it's done. I'm really sorry about that. So yes, what you've been looking at is a totally different table. That's not very helpful. Okay, I assume that when I open the link, it would show, but of course it doesn't because it's a different tab. Let me correct that. Here we go. So now you can see what I've actually been talking about, right? Sorry about that. So you can see I've highlighted the number of cores, but this is the overview I was looking at to show the diversity of architectures that are available. Yeah, so you see I was highlighting the CPU, the processors that are there, and also the listed here, and also the accelerators. And not many of them have accelerators. You can have a look to see if you're interested about how much memory there is typically per node, and there's information about the type of interconnect. So that's give you some sense also of the number of cores that are involved. Look at the chat. Rui, you cannot see. I think other people are seeing.
Yeah, I can see the table fine, Arno. So,
good. Okay.
Rui, if you can't see, I would suggest maybe reloading the page.
Okay, so you can get access to, and I'll make sure I do share that. Okay, back to project access. Okay, so there's information on this website to get access, and you have to put in a proposal based on the research you want to do. So, now there is more recently there is a new organization or new sort of political agreement that's been formed by participating EU member states and some associated countries as well to sort of succeed PRACE in terms of providing the infrastructure, and namely Euro HPC. So we'll have a look at the Euro HPC website as well. Euro HPC. There we go. Okay, so Euro HPC is a so-called joint undertaking between member states, and so Euro HPC is responsible for the infrastructure, a lot of the largest newer systems that are being deployed and installed right now. In fact, so if we go to About and Discover, And we can see that there are a number of different systems that are currently being planned and installed. So the three largest ones are in Finland, in Italy, and in Spain. So in Finland, currently being installed. Oh, actually, I think it's due. Yeah, currently being installed and due to become operational later this year. There's a machine called Lumi, which is a Cray machine, HPE Cray, and you can look at some of the details here. So it will have a peak performance of half an exaflop. So it's kind of comparable to the Fugaku machine that I talked about earlier, which is currently operational in Japan. And in terms of the hardware, it's going to have AMD EPYC CPUs, 64 cores, combined with AMD GPUs. And yeah, there's more information here about memory, etc., etc. Then Leonardo is the second of the three largest ones. So Leonardo is the machine that will be located in Bologna at the Cineca High Performance Computing Center in Italy. And that will offer a little bit under half an exaflop peak, and that will be using Intel processors, so Ice Lake Booster as a CPU, and it will have NVIDIA GPUs, so not AMD but NVIDIA GPUs. I think this is going to be the Ampere, the A100 that I also mentioned the Duals Booster has. Okay, and then the third one, the third largest one, the successor to the Mare Nostrum machines, the one that will be located in Barcelona. I don't think the information about the exact architecture here yet. So we could, but other than that, the other systems, the smaller systems, so these three large ones are called pre-exascale because they are not quite an exaflop yet. Then there are 5 smaller ones which are petascale because that's how many, that's what their performance is. We can have a quick look at some of the architecture there. So the system in Luxembourg will be AMD EPYC with NVIDIA Ampere. Okay, fine. Vega in Slovenia will be, the petaflops. That's not 10 petaflops. Okay. And then Vega in Slovenia will be just under about 10 petaflops, and that's a combination of, again, AMD EPYC with NVIDIA A100. Then the system in Czechia, which will be 10 petaflops, and it will be, let's see, CUDA A100, check, okay. And the CPU, can't see that right now. And what tier are these? I guess you could describe them as tier 2. If you wanted to, yeah. Well, maybe maybe more like tier 1 actually. The definition changed a bit over time because what you think of as large also changes. So, but maybe it's about usage, and if these are funded by EuroHPC and based in member states, and they're meant to provide access to at least the country where they're situated, if not a slightly wider region, then I guess you could think of them as tier 1. System in Bulgaria, again, AMD EPYC with node accelerators for a change. And there's a system in Portugal, which will be, exciting, the A64FX Fujitsu. It will have some of those, as well as AMD EPYC and NVIDIA Ampere. So that's just an overview. So you can see a lot of the systems that are coming to various regions around the EU are going to be a mix of this kind of architecture. So that just gives you an idea, and I don't think there's any information yet about how to get access to the EuroHPC machines because they're still quite an early stage. That's yet to come. Okay, so I will leave that there. That's kind of, rough idea of the landscape about what's available. So then, well, if anybody has any questions about any of that, otherwise we can go over to the course review if you like, Julian.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. Right, so this is our final session for this course, and it's a quick review of the course, quick review of what we hope you'll have taken away from this course, an overview of where you can go next, what your next steps could be, and where to look for further information. And then, as I said, a bootstrapping session, which I'll talk about a bit more in a sec. So during this course, our primary aim in this course was to teach you the basics of high-performance computing and to give a broad overview of how it can be used for life science research. We've really been trying to gear this course towards answering the following, towards making sure that now, if you didn't know the answers prior to this course, you will now know the answers to what is high performance computing, why do people use high performance computers, and what are the softwares and hardware components that make up a high performance computer. And also we touched about the software and hardware that make up most PCs, most local computers. We also wanted you to have an idea of how these components can affect the performance of certain applications and how they work to make sure that all of the applications you're interested in work properly. And finally, we also wanted to make sure that you had a better understanding, if you didn't have an understanding beforehand, of how applications can tackle problems in parallel. Now, during this course, you'll have had access to ARCHER2, and we've aimed to provide you with, a very hands-on practical approach to using HPC facilities. And we were really happy. Arno, Holly, and I are really happy with how well you engaged with some of the practicals. I find it great how many people answered and shared their results for the various cpgk and GROMACS practicals. I felt it really made for a much more interesting experience and made it so much nicer to see and to compare the various results that we got. So we hope that now you'll have a better idea of how to, we hope that through this course you'll have been able to play around on a HPC facility, and that now if this was your first time on a HPC facility, and indeed if this was your first time on a tier 1 HPC facility, you're maybe a bit more confident about how easy it can be. And if this wasn't your first time, then you're still at least equally confident about how easy it can be to use HPC facilities. We hope that you have obtained a better idea of how to really get the most out of the resources at your disposal and to make sure that your codes are running as best they can. And in particular, we hope that this course will have given you more experience of using a HPC machine and dealing with the common stumbling blocks. For ARCHER2, definitely login springs to mind, but there's also some other problems that might happen when submitting Slurm jobs, etc., etc. We hope you'll have had a better notion of how to evaluate parallel performance, and that now you understand what is meant when people say, scalability or parallel performance for various applications. And that you'll also take what we've tried to talk about and apply it to your specific research or your specific work in future, so that maybe now in the back of your head, in the back of your mind, you'll have you'll have that nagging little voice that says, well, maybe I shouldn't just double the number of processors here because maybe it won't actually necessarily speed things up. We hope we really hope we've given you an understanding of the current and near future HPC facilities that are available here and around the world, and given you an appreciation of the challenges of running life science pipelines and workflows on HPC systems. And actually, I didn't raise this point earlier, but my partner does metagenomic analysis, and the pipe flow that Arno shared with you during the pipe flow lecture is probably amongst the nicer ones that she's shared with me. Some of the things they do is really scary. But still, it's part of life science and definitely something that's definitely done on HPC facilities. And finally, we hope that we've been able to show you how HPC can benefit your research and how to get access to HPC facilities in the EU and in the UK. So now that leads us to where next? Well, we mentioned at the start, and it's important to mention again, this course is a massive collaboration between a number of different groups. There's the BioExcel Center for Excellence, which is involved. There's EPCC, who are the people who hire Arno, Holly, and I, and me. And then finally, there's PRACE, which is also involved. And through these three, we've also been able to get access to ARCHER2, which is run by UKRI, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can find the list of everyone involved in some way, larger or smaller, in the on the main page of the course website, where it shows that, yeah, so University of Edinburgh is involved because technically EPCC is part of the University of Edinburgh, ARCHER2 I've mentioned, UKRI, the UK Research Institute, and CRAE, who provide ARCHER2 and a lot of the support for ARCHER2 as well, have all in some way, big or small, been involved. Yeah, that's the right one. And each of BioXL, EPCC, and PRACE have a great track record at providing a variety of courses, which range from introductory courses like this one to much more expert courses and much more focused courses. BioXL is focused primarily on the use of HPC for life sciences. They offer a number of webinars and courses, and I'll just click on these links real quick to show you a list. The webinars are often, like, there's a number of webinars. Usually there's at least once a month. They're at least once a month, often more than that. Recently they did an entire series about best practices for QMMM, but there's also webinars about, what's the word I'm looking for? Webinars about GROMACS and any updates to GROMACS that are done through BioXL. There's webinars from leading scientists around the world in simulation of biological systems. And they're very interesting, and all are available on the link there. Likewise, they do a number of courses. That's the right one. So at the moment, there is only one course advertised, but this can change and fluctuate quite often. At the moment, the main course advertised, and I've been asked to mention this, is the BioXL summer school on biomolecular simulation. And the BioXL summer school is a 5-day summer school, which is running from the 7th to the 11th of June, and you'll also need to go to the introduction on the 4th of June. Registration fee of €50, but you need to submit an application to be selected, and only if you've been selected to attend the school or do you have to pay the registration fee. It is, I believe, entirely online this year, though previously in more normal times it's in some lovely locations in Europe. I know that the one last year was meant to be in Sardinia, and I try really hard to be involved, but then for obvious reasons it didn't happen in Sardinia, and I've still not been to Sardinia. It's rather sad. But the summer school itself really focuses on trying to give the attendees hands-on experience on using the codes that BioXL supports and helps develop. So codes like GROMACS, codes like hadoop, codes like CP2K, PMX, BioBB, and things like that. And it aims to really give the attendees a lot of hand-on experience of running molecular dynamic simulations, understanding more about biomolecular docking, free energy calculations, and many things like that. If you're at all interested in this, it's a great course. It's gotten great feedback. I've put the link to it in the course website. So through ARCHER2, EPCC provides a wide range of courses and webinars as well. So you'll have hopefully already seen the list of courses and webinars, because one of the ones that, well, one of the links that we definitely sent to you was a link to the Introduction to HPC page on the ARCHER2 website, but there are a number of other courses and webinars available. Whereas BioXL is very focused on the biological side of things, EPCC is much more focused on the HPC side of things. So the courses here are much more about how to, for instance, to program, how to write parallel programs, or programs that will run well in parallel, such as this MPI, message passing programming with MPI course, which is running simultaneously to this course, incidentally. There's also a how to do shared memory programming with OpenMP, which you can, it's a self-service course which you can do in your own time. But then there's also a large number of other courses which can run, which can be from how to better use ARCHER2 to how to use containers and understanding the basics of containers to how to run with Python to how to loads and loads and loads of things. And interspersed with that, there's a number of 1 hour long webinar sessions on a wide range of topics, ranging from how to use containers in HPC, quantum computing without a quantum computer, how do you model quantum computing when there are no quantum computers available at the moment, and many other things like that. Now, both BioExcel and EPCC will very, very often and usually record their webinars and most of their courses. And I forgot to show this for the BioExcel one, but these courses have already run, so March 10, we're past March 10. If you click on, if you go on any of these courses, there's usually a link to the YouTube, well, there should be a link. Maybe there isn't yet.
It says March 10th because that's when the page was published, not when the webinar actually took place.
Oh, of course, yeah, sorry.
This webinar is happening tomorrow. No, sorry, next week, Tuesday.
Yes, that's correct, yeah. But this one's definitely happened because that one happened on the 11th. And if you go on there, there's a link to the YouTube video for that particular webinar that happened. Likewise for EPCC under ARCHER2, all of the courses that have run, and I've mentioned this about this course before, this course will be the same as all the other ones, all of the courses and webinars that have happened under the EPCC ARCHER2 umbrella are available online afterwards, all of the, which means, well, if you'd missed any parts of this course, for instance, if, for instance, you had to take a call and you missed part of the course that you're wanting to follow up on, you can go on the this link, which I've provided in the final page of the course, and find the appropriate course, which in this case would be Introduction to Life Sciences, to HPC for Life Scientists, and you would find all of the videos for that, which I think is great because this means that there's a great repository of a lot of, frankly, very good courses, in my opinion, predominantly aimed at more HPC-focused parallel programming kind of things, so like GPU programming with CUDA, for instance, and Docker and things like that. So if HPC is what you're more interested in, there's loads there at the EPCC website. And finally, Prace is also predominantly focused on HPC and programming for HPC. It also offers a really interesting summer program, which in this case is the Summer of HPC program. This is more aimed at BScs and MSc students. However, it's a really cool idea, so please do feel free to advertise it. The idea is you can apply to this, and if you're selected, you'll get I believe it's a 2-week crash course on generally how to use HPC, follow 2 months working with people from one of the Prace HPC centers around Europe. So it's a great way to spend a summer working with these really awesome systems. They also provide, I didn't know this, they did this until yesterday, but they also provide a fantastic number of short tutorials to help you learn about certain aspects of parallel programming. So for instance, they have a series of short video tutorials about using message passing interface, using OpenMP, and things like that. It's definitely worth checking out if programming in parallel is something that you're keen on trying your hand at and doing. They've also run a number of courses related to HPC, many of which are available online afterwards, like the other two. I put this link last because I find that their website's a bit not great looking. However, if you take the time to look like at the training events or the HPC training events, you'll find that there are a number of really cool sounding courses. So these are the events that are coming up in the future. You've got things like modern C++. You've also got other training events. Let's go with training center events. Most of which are currently online. One of the, yeah, even in regular times, most praise training or a lot of praise training is also available online. So this is a great resource for learning if you're interested into using Python and scikit on HPC systems, for instance. There's a course for that, and they give you access often to all of these HPC systems that we've talked about. You know, Mare Nostrum, Arno definitely mentioned. I don't know if they have any Pizdane course. They must have. Anyways, so that's where you can find more courses and more, what's the word I'm looking for? More courses and more videos from previous courses, if that's what you're after. If you're after a more hands-on experience, for this course, you've all had to make ARCHER2 accounts, and these accounts will remain in place These accounts will remain in place. We're not going to be deleting these accounts. On top of that, the budget code TA017 associated with these accounts is available until the 24th of April. So that means that for the next full month, you're more than welcome to log on to ARCHER2, try out your systems, play around with it, whatever you want. There's about 1,000 node hours available on the system at the under that budget at the moment. Use what you can of it, because essentially, if there's anything left on the 24th of April, it just disappears. Also, do bear in mind, however, that if you use all of it, then it will disappear before the 24th of April, right? We're not topping it up if it gets used up entirely. But please do use it. Usually it's hugely underused, and it's a bit of a shame. And what can you do with this? Well, you can test your systems. You can, even test your systems. Maybe run some of the test systems that we proposed. Maybe try even bigger systems. See whether the scaling stays the same, or whatever you want. It's there for you to use as you want. And now to finish the session, we'll, as I mentioned, we will do an open consultation bootstrapping session where Arno, Holly, and I will stay here for the next, I'm going to say roughly half hour, and we will happily answer any and all questions that you throw at us, and at least to the best of our knowledge. Maybe we won't know that is an answer, but we're more than happy to help to help answer any questions that you might still have about this course, about your specific research, about how your specific research could be made better using HPC, about which HPC facilities best fit the research you're interested in, even, and things like that. So please do ask all of the questions that you have. We're more than happy to answer them. And because this is probably the last time that we'll be talking to you as a group, I definitely thank you all for coming. It's been really fun teaching all of you. I've certainly loved how responsive you've all been to all of, like, in the practicals. It's been great really spending time with you. We hope you enjoyed the course. And one final thing I wanted to mention is that on the ARCHER2 training page for this course, which I will put a link in the chat in a sec, there is at the very bottom of the page a feedback button. And if you could take a couple of minutes to, I think it's probably no more than 2 minutes, if you could take a couple of minutes to fill out some feedback for this course, that would be really useful and helpful for us in a number of ways. For one, it would help us know what we could improve on so that next time we run a course, we'll be better at it, and it'll be better for it. But for two, it's also very useful for us to, like, this course is free, and and it's really useful for us to be able to use some of the feedback to say, look, this course was worth doing, the great feedback we've got, or look at the number of participants we've got and things like that. And it's really, really helpful for us going forward to then be able to keep getting money to provide these courses. So with that, thank you very much for coming here. I'm sure Arno and Holly probably also want to say one or two final words, maybe?
Yeah, great. I agree with all of that. It's been really, really great with everybody engaging with the course. I might as well. Well, I don't know. Holly, do you want to say anything? I was going to look at Richard's question, but
I was just going to say thanks to everyone for coming and participating. It was really good to see so many people participating in the practicals and adding their stuff to the Etherpad. So yeah, thanks for that, and yeah, thanks for coming.
yeah. So I already saw Richard put a question in the. We can kick off, I guess, the kind of consulting session or the discussing stuff session now. So Richard's question is, do you have any recommendations regarding the amount of benchmarking that should be done when you're running your own research or own systems on various HPC infrastructures? How much learning regarding the performance is transferable, and I guess you mean transferable from one system, from one HPC machine to another HPC machine? I think assume nothing. For one thing, is until you are, if you launch things, if you don't, so your job might run. You go log onto a new machine, you maybe compile your code, or you set your calculation up. It might just run right away. Just you might get lucky, right? You might understand everything right away correctly first. But even if it does work, then there's no saying that you've chosen the right parameters. I mean, I would say make no assumptions. Verify and check. Try to whenever you're logging onto a new system, finding a new system to run things on, have a couple of I guess systems that, like you say, you benchmark, that you know kind of what to expect from the performance, and think about what kind of hardware it's running on this new system compared to other systems that you've already run it on in the past. So if you know that on a system with a particular GPU, if it's got a V100 GPU, and it's got like an Intel CPU of a certain age, certain model, then you expect roughly that kind of performance, and then you run on a different system that has the same GPU but a slightly newer Intel processor, then yeah, there's probably not much difference. Depending, well, if it's doing a lot of communication and the interconnect is a lot worse or a lot better, then yeah, the memory is a lot different, then yeah. But I would say check. Some things will transfer, but you should check. Do you want to? You can use your. I say people free to use your mic if you want to sort of respond to that. Or see that does that answer your question?
So really quickly, one thing I'd add as well. Oh, sorry.
A general feel, and I think, as I said, it's not necessarily that I in particular would go about this, but just trying to understand whether there is any transferability between systems and maybe the approach. I think you covered the approach, and I think that's important. Just getting a sense of what are things to sort of think about, what assumptions can you make, if any.
So actually, that was one thing I was going to add, is super important when choosing your benchmarks is you want something that runs quickly. You don't want to be spending hours waiting for your benchmark to finish, because that's a waste of resources. And usually what ends up happening is, because you're running the same small system, so for molecular dynamics, for instance, you'd be running the same bench MEM system, which is 80,000 atoms, you end up getting a bit of a feel for when it usually dies off and how it usually dies off. And then from having run this on 1 core, 2 cores, 4 cores, and et cetera, up to 1 node, 2 nodes, 4 nodes, 8 nodes, you end up very quickly being able to tell, okay, well, this is how much I can push this particular HPC facility versus this other one versus this other one. So reusing benchmarks and using small benchmarks is really useful. Oh, that's weird. Is this true of everyone or just Richard?
I could hear you just fine. Yeah. I could hear Richard. I could hear.
So one of the questions is, what will be the reservation number for further usage until April, the 24th of April? There will be none. So you will need to get rid of the reservation line if you're running on standard, and you'll need to use the short QoS reservation if you're running on short. All of this is documented in the ARCHER2 documentations. I'll dig up the web page for you for finding this. But essentially, we set up reservations specifically for this course, and past the end of the course, we don't have any reservations.
So I would like to try something actually as a question. I mean, people, please feel free to enter any question that you have for us. But I'd like to ask everybody who's still here a question, namely the distinction between processor, core, and CPU, which a lot of people find or found maybe at the beginning possibly confusing. Can you put your hand up if that is if you found it confusing to begin with, but it's now less confusing? Okay, great. So Miguel, the question I had was that for people who found the distinction between what is a processor, what is a core, what is a CPU, if they found that confusing at first, do they now find it less confusing? So the question about HPC hardware for MD, I mean, you're right. GPUs, I mean, Chromix in particular, but other codes as well, run very well on GPUs. And in fact, Chromix in particular has recently made a few changes that allowed it to offload lots of other parts than just non-bonded interactions to GPU very effectively. So that is indeed very appealing. So yeah, I would suggest that finding a machine with lots of recent powerful GPUs, the more per node. Okay, this is probably probably good. In terms of binding energies and free energy calculations, any suggestions? Are you interested in suggestions for how to perform these calculations, or interested in suggestions of what HPC infrastructure or other kind of infrastructure hardware they might run well on? Okay, and so the tutorial that you were referring to was part of another training course, or it's one of the ones that's provided publicly on our BioXL GitHub or on the BioXL website? Yeah, so I don't think any of the people, Ollie or myself or Julian, were not involved in putting together those tutorials. So I don't think we can advise on the specifics, the good transition in lambdas. I wouldn't know. So I suggest you try to contact either, if you still have contact details of the individual person who gave the session, who ran the session, or well, if you do email one of us, that's fine. We can put you in touch with the relevant people. There's also the Ask BioExcel forum, which is actually come to think of it, that's probably that's probably the better place to ask it, I think. So I'll put the link in the chat. So it's ask.bioexcel.eu, and there, I was trying to think of the best section. We have a section on, well, it's code, some of it's code specific. It's free energy. If it uses PMX, maybe it's that. See what is the best, the most logical place to ask, and people will hopefully be able to respond. That's probably the best idea, actually.
Amna, did you have your hand up to answer Arno's previous question, or did you want to ask a question as well?
So I'm just going to keep asking you questions unless we get some other questions as well. So I wanted to ask, so Ludovico, I don't know if you're still listening, but if you are, I remember you had a question on day one, which was you were wondering if hey, thanks. Okay, you were wondering, does software need to be designed to run specifically on HPC in terms of task management, or will it just treat HPC as multi-threaded machines with just more hardware? And I was saying, okay, well, maybe it'll become clearer on Monday or in other days. Is that now clearer, or is there anything else we can help to clarify? By the way, if you would like to use your mic to answer that instead of typing, that's fine. But if you want to type, that's fine.
Oh, yeah, might be faster to do so. Well, as I've written, when I was learning Romex, I remember one of the distinguishing features that was claimed from, the official. Is it official? I'm not sure if it's official. The website where you start, getting your hands on, was that Romex was specifically designed to be able to run in multi-thread. And in the software that I am using right now, especially ACMD, this is something that seems like becoming a trend into software implementations. So it is a good indicator that this is the way to go for the future, because as we have seen during these lectures, the potential of using multi-cores, multi-threading is enormous, basically. And yeah, that answered my question.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the multi-threading is very useful way to be able to use one node, and then across nodes, it uses MPI. In fact, Gromex is a bit funny because they've done something clever, which is they've implemented. It's not really, it's just details, but if you look at, they've got something called thread MPI, which is very confusing when you first read it, because you think, hang on, are they talking about threads or are they talking about MPI? I don't understand. But anyway, this distinction is not worth making. But yeah, they've implemented multi-threading as well as MPI-based parallelism, so they can run on a single node, multi-threaded, and across nodes using MPI, and of course, as we already iterated, make use of GPUs very efficiently.
And maybe in the future, this is something that all the other softwares and might start implementing. And as far as I remember, There is no, at this moment in time, maybe I'm wrong, please take what I said with a pinch of salt. There is no implementation for FEP calculation with GPUs, and so that could be another, way to go to improve the actual calculations possibilities with quantum mechanical models and setups.
Yeah, I wouldn't know actually. I don't know enough to be able to know whether that specific free energy perturbation can be done with GPU. But yeah, I'll take a note of that.
So far, nothing. There is nothing on that side. So I think it would be a good thing to consider to see if somebody will ever make it to implement that and exploit all the possibilities of multiple GPUs in bigger clustered systems for that purpose would be great.
Yes.
By the way, thank you.
No worries. The thread MPI, I probably shouldn't even have mentioned it because it's just confusing, especially if you just had a course telling you that threads and MPI are two different things.
Two different things, indeed. But yeah, I'll leave these two as better into this field.
Yeah, no, I was referring to a question that Amna was asking to repeat what thread MPI is, and it's a little bit complicated. I don't know if it's So basically, what thread MPI is, it's something that GROMACS has implemented to means that a part of GROMACS can pretend that it's running MPI, but actually it's running on different threads. So it's like the threads are passing messages between each other. But this is a very subtle point about parallel programming that's not really necessarily interesting or really that important, I think, to know if you're running GROMACS. But if you're interested, you can have a look at the on the documentation. I think it mentions MPI. I'll post a link. Same getting good performance from MD-Run page. If you look for thread-MPI, you'll find some information there.
Thank you.